High school graduation was usually filled with bright emotions and pleasant impressions, but for the Murphy family, this day became a day of mourning. 17-year-old Alexis was supposed to walk onto the stage with her classmates, but the beast decided to take her life in the most horrific way. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Alexis Tiara Murphy was born on June 5, 1996, in Charlottesville, Virginia, to Laura and Troy. She was her parents' only daughter. Besides her, they had 3 sons. Alexis was a true girly girl. Her favorite color was, of course, pink. She always cared deeply about her appearance and could spend hours styling her unruly hair if she was going out. To keep up with fashion trends, Alexis bought magazines, picked out a look she liked, and tried to recreate it. She loved shopping and collecting vintage clothing. In the future, she dreamed of becoming a famous model. She had a cheerful personality and was always full of positivity. Her contagious laughter often echoed from her room when everyone else had long been asleep. Alexis would stay up late watching comedy shows on TV. Her mother frequently heard her laughing into her pillow to muffle the sound. A sincere, sociable, and kind-hearted girl, Alexis grew from a happy child into a bright and positive teenager. She loved dancing and sports. She played volleyball in high school and planned to join a college team. She eagerly looked forward to the future and embraced every day with joy. Her family said that Alexis was an extraordinary person with a warm heart. Her humor and laughter always resonated with those around her. She had a special way of connecting with children, and little kids always followed her around in a crowd. She was a friend who could truly listen and give honest advice. A sister who cherished her brothers, even when they got on her nerves. A daughter her parents were proud of. A niece who could always be relied on. And one day, she was gone. Saturday, August 3rd, 2013, was an ordinary day. In the morning, 17-year-old Alexis was hanging around the house, unsure of how to keep herself busy, as she had plans for the second half of the day. She wanted to go buy some hair extensions to style her hair for a photo shoot. Meanwhile, her mother, Laura, was getting ready for her night shift at work. She gave her daughter some money, kissed her, and asked her to be careful while driving. Alexis borrowed her father's car to drive from their home in Shipman, Virginia, to Lynchburg. The drive to Lynchburg usually took about 20 minutes, and Alexis left shortly after 3 p.m. At the time, her mother, Laura, had no idea she was seeing her daughter for the last time. Alexis walked out of the house, got into the car, and waved goodbye to her mother. On her way back at 6:40 p.m., she posted a short message on social media where she had a large following, about 12,000 subscribers. And after that, Alexis disappeared. Alexis had a curfew and was supposed to be home by midnight. She was never late. When her grandmother, who lived with them, noticed that her granddaughter had not returned, she became worried and immediately contacted Laura. The woman had just finished her night shift and was heading home. She immediately sensed that something was wrong and started calling her daughter's number over and over again, but there was no answer. Laura knew that something was seriously off because Alexis never parted with her phone. The family used to joke that it was glued to her palm. She slept with it, took it into the shower, ate with it. Even when she put it on the charger, she used an extension cord so she could move around the house with it. For Alexis, not coming home on time and not answering her phone was so out of character that Laura immediately contacted her husband. Troy called the police to report his daughter missing. He tried to stay calm and not panic, knowing he needed to be strong for the family and not assume the worst. But the fact that Alexis hadn't made it home by curfew deeply unsettled him. As he drove to the sheriff's office, 100 terrible thoughts raced through his mind. Surprisingly, the police took the report seriously right away, even though only a short time had passed. They did not, as they often do, assume that she had gone off to party or got caught up chatting with friends and would be back soon. Instead, they immediately launched a search for the high school senior. The first place they went was an estate called Oak Ridge. Alexis's family was able to track her last possible location using the Find My iPhone app, but no traces of the girl were found there. Detectives turned to the missing girl's social media accounts to see if any of her followers might have been involved in her disappearance. However, this turned out to be an overwhelming task, as they would have had to check more than 10,000 people, many of whom were registered under fake names. Still, social media helped spread information about her disappearance very quickly. Investigators also requested Alexis's phone records to determine which cell towers had last pinged her mobile. Meanwhile, they began checking Highway 29, which leads to Lynchburg. Police examined several locations along the Shipman-Lynchburg route and discovered that on August 3rd at 7 p.m., Alexis had stopped at the Liberty gas station in Lovingston. Surveillance footage from the gas station showed her walking in and purchasing gas. She appeared completely normal, not upset or scared. While there was nothing unusual in the footage, it helped police narrow down the timeline of the incident and determine what Alexis was wearing when she was last seen. Video footage provides a much clearer picture than a verbal description of someone's appearance. Alexis was wearing a pink top, floral print spandex pants, and brown boots. Her phone last connected to a cell tower at 7:15 p.m., just 1.5 kilometers from the gas station, before going completely silent. This meant that something could have happened to her within those 15 minutes, and most likely it had to have happened near the gas station. A massive search operation was launched, involving family, friends, volunteers, police, and the FBI. A helicopter searched from the air for any signs of Alexis's car. 3 days after her disappearance, the high schooler's car was found parked near a movie theater in Charlottesville, more than 30 miles from where Alexis was last seen. Inside and outside the vehicle, there was nothing that could help police get closer to finding Alexis. Detectives obtained surveillance footage from a nearby shopping center. The footage showed a white Nissan Maxima pulling into the movie theater parking lot at 10:30 p.m. on August 5th, a full day after Alexis was last seen. The video was extremely low quality, making it impossible to determine who was driving the car. Despite the FBI's efforts to enhance the footage and remove the graininess, nothing could be done. It was unclear whether the driver was a man or a woman, and there were no distinguishing features. However, Alexis's parents, after just a brief glance at the video, immediately said it was not her. She would never have left her father's car in an unfamiliar place, and she had no reason to be there. Moreover, Alexis had been afraid of the dark since childhood, and by then it was already nighttime. Investigators returned to their starting point, the gas station footage. In the surveillance footage, officers noticed a man holding the door open for Alexis as she was leaving the gas station. It appeared that they were not acquainted, and the man's gesture seemed like a simple act of politeness. However, police wanted to speak with the stranger seen in the footage in case he remembered anything. The man had a distinctive neck tattoo of Daffy Duck, making him easy to identify. He was driving a camouflage Chevrolet. Detectives spoke with the gas station employees and soon learned that the man's name was Randy, and he was a regular at the 24-hour convenience store. He frequently bought alcohol and cigarettes there. Randy turned out to be 48-year-old Randolph Allen Taylor. The man had a criminal record. He had previously been arrested for arson and burglary. These crimes were, of course, different from abduction and murder. However, investigators believed that Taylor might have been responsible for other offenses that had yet to be proven. Once they learned his real name, the police were able to locate his residence. Law enforcement officers and FBI agents went to the given address and found an abandoned house. The house was located on Highway 29, near the main road. However, it was hidden from view by dense vegetation. As police searched the property and the surrounding land, they discovered the Chevrolet. Shortly after, Randy Taylor himself came outside. detectives explained to him that they were investigating the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl named Alexis Murphy and asked where he had been on August 3, 2013. Taylor fully cooperated with the police. He even invited them into his trailer and gave a detailed account of what he was doing on the Saturday when Alexis disappeared. According to him, he had never met the girl in the photograph and was not at the Liberty gas station that day. On August 3rd, Taylor admitted to having a few drinks and refueling his vehicle, but he claimed it was at a completely different location. When he was informed that Liberty employees had seen him at the gas station that Saturday, the man acted as if he simply didn't remember. In reality, detectives had another piece of footage that they had discovered later, video from an external camera at the gas station. The footage clearly showed Taylor and Alexis talking. After their conversation, both got into their cars and drove off the parking lot, one after the other. Since Taylor had initially denied being at the Liberty gas station that day and seeing the missing girl, suspicion against him immediately grew. However, the man continued to deny ever speaking with Alexis Murphy or that she had ever been in his trailer or on his property. He only broke down after being confronted with the gas station surveillance footage. Taylor then began spinning a fabricated story, claiming that he actually did know the girl. He said they had once run into each other at a car dealership where he was working part-time. Alexis had been there with her aunt. Taylor recognized her and started a conversation. During their talk, Taylor said he had been smoking weed, and Alexis liked the smell. He simply offered her to try some and invited her to follow him. According to Taylor, Alexis was not alone in the car. She had a friend with her. And so, they went to visit Taylor. Whether this version of events was true remains unknown. Alexis's mother insisted that her daughter had never used substances like that. However, teenagers don't always tell their parents about their bad habits. Still, this was only one version of events, the one given by the suspect. And the only person who could refute it was Alexis herself. But unfortunately, she was no longer able to do so. Although Taylor claimed that the young people had hung out with him for a while and then safely went home, detectives didn't believe him. They showed him several photos of young men from Alexis's social media. Taylor pointed at one of Alexis's classmates who matched the description. The problem, however, was that this young man had been out of state with his parents on August 3rd and couldn't have possibly been at Taylor's trailer that night. Detectives saw that Taylor was trying to steer the investigation in the wrong direction, so they obtained a warrant to search his trailer and the surrounding area. Inside the camper, police found a diamond stud earring, a fingernail, and long black hair. They believed these items belonged to Alexis. The evidence was sent to a lab for analysis. Swabs taken from the diamond stud, along with the fingernail and hair, matched Alexis Murphy's DNA. On top of that, police brought in search dogs trained to detect mobile devices, flash drives, and other gadgets to comb the area around the trailer. About 60 feet from Taylor's trailer, they found Alexis's cell phone. The phone was nearly destroyed, its screen was completely shattered, and the battery had been ripped out. Due to the severe physical damage, experts were unable to recover any data from the device. However, the fact that Alexis was never without her phone, along with the fingernail, hair, and earring found in the trailer, suggested that something terrible had happened to her. Then, investigators received new information. Just 45 minutes before Taylor went to the Liberty gas station, he had purchased 2 adult films at a nearby store. Detectives decided to conduct a second search of his trailer, and what they discovered made the situation look even worse. Local police and FBI agents found additional evidence. Taylor owned a scrapbook filled with cutout photos of naked women in lewd poses. He had printed pictures of his acquaintances and random girls from social media, pasting their faces onto the bodies in the images. But the most horrifying discovery was under the couch, Alexis's pink top, the one she had been wearing that day, along with hair extensions and false eyelashes. Bloodstains were found on the back of the top. Further forensic testing confirmed that the blood belonged to Alexis Murphy. In the end, Randy Taylor was arrested and charged with a first-degree felony. Authorities believed that he had lured Alexis into his trailer under false pretenses and then took her life. The crime was believed to have been motivated by sexual intent. The suspect was jailed without bail. For Taylor, this came as a complete shock. When the handcuffs were placed on him, his expression resembled that of a deer caught in headlights. He simply had not expected the police to bring charges against him so quickly. It seemed that he had gotten away with crimes before and was confident it would happen again. Things moved fast because detectives also suspected Taylor was responsible for the September 2010 disappearance of another young woman, 19-year-old Samantha Clark. Samantha had gone missing in Orange, Virginia, about 30 miles from Charlottesville. At the time of her disappearance, Samantha and Taylor had lived in the same trailer park, and he had called her shortly before she vanished. On September 13, 2010, Samantha was home with her younger brother, Hunter. Their mother was working a night shift. When their mother left for work, her older daughter was in her pajamas, watching TV in the living room. That night, Hunter called their mother's work number and said that Samantha had left after receiving a phone call. She had promised to be back soon, but by 1:30 a.m., she still hadn't returned. When their mother came home in the morning, she found Samantha's pajamas on her bed. The only thing missing was the house key. She had taken nothing else with her. The situation was strange. Her mother knew that Samantha never went out at night. Public transportation wasn't running either, so where could she have gone on foot at that hour? Hoping the situation would resolve itself, her mother dropped Hunter off at school and took a nap after her shift. She was sure that by the time she woke up, Samantha would be home to explain everything. After all, she was an adult and could leave the house without permission. But when Samantha still hadn't returned a few hours later, her mother went to the police station to report the issue. She was told to wait 48 hours before filing a missing person report. Samantha's family searched for her in vain, walking through the neighborhood and calling friends. But no one had seen or heard from her in the past few days. When law enforcement finally got involved, they were able to determine whom Samantha had spoken with before she vanished. It turned out that their trailer park neighbor, 45-year-old Randy Taylor, had called Samantha's number 6 times and was the last person to speak to her before she abruptly left in the middle of the night. The police questioned Taylor. He claimed that Samantha had been involved with a married man, and he had called to warn her. According to him, the man's wife had found out and was threatening to teach her a lesson. Taylor insisted he was simply trying to warn Samantha to stay away from him. In Samantha Clark's disappearance case, there wasn't enough evidence to arrest Randy Taylor. But he remained the primary suspect. Even though this had happened in 2010, detectives noticed undeniable connections between the two cases. The two counties where the girls had disappeared were only an hour apart, and the last person both of them spoke to before vanishing was Randy Taylor. Both families believed that this man was responsible for their daughters' disappearances. Unfortunately, Samantha Clark's case remains unsolved. Alexis's mother, Laura, even wanted to meet with Taylor and talk to him one-on-one. She knew that the man had children and hoped to appeal to his paternal instincts. Laura clung to the hope that Taylor had kidnapped her daughter and was keeping her somewhere. She refused to even consider the possibility that Alexis was no longer alive. The only thing that kept her going each morning was the hope of her daughter's return, or at least some information about her whereabouts. Billboards with Alexis's photos were put up along Highway 29, the road she had been traveling home on. Laura gave several interviews, making public statements and pleading for help from the community. People rallied around the Murphy family. Their home was constantly filled with friends and acquaintances who helped with household tasks so that the parents could focus on the search. Laura and Troy's co-workers donated their vacation time so the couple could have extra days off. Alexis's social media followers posted photos of themselves wearing pink t-shirts with her image, using the hashtag #PinkForAlexis. Her disappearance truly captured widespread attention. Two musicians even made a music video about missing girls, mentioning Alexis in the lyrics. Meanwhile, the Murphy family waited for Randy Taylor's trial. The man never pleaded guilty, insisting that Alexis and her friend had left his trailer unharmed, and that he had no idea what happened to her afterward. Taylor's lawyer pushed for the trial to be moved to another city, arguing that the local community had already convicted his client in the court of public opinion. He was frustrated by how the media portrayed Taylor as guilty before the trial had even begun. The town where Alexis disappeared was very small, just over 500 residents and an area of only 10 square kilometers. People were determined to see justice served against the criminal who had disturbed their town and cast a shadow over its name. However, the judge denied the defense attorney's request. Instead, he issued a gag order, preventing attorneys, police officers, and all involved parties from publicly discussing case details. Jury selection then began. 8 women and 6 men were chosen. Initially, the prosecution offered Taylor a plea deal to avoid trial. They promised to request a minimum sentence of 20 years if he pleaded guilty. But Taylor refused. Instead, he made his own counteroffer. He would serve only 10 years in exchange for revealing the location of Alexis's remains. Despite insisting throughout the investigation that he had nothing to do with Alexis's disappearance, when faced with the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars, he suddenly wanted to make a deal, but only on his terms. Of course, the prosecutor refused to negotiate. Alexis's parents, Laura and Troy, were also informed of Taylor's offer. As desperate as they were to finally learn where their daughter was, they also couldn't bear the thought of Taylor being released early, only to harm someone else in the future. On May 1st, 2014, the trial of Randy Taylor, accused of kidnapping and murdering 17-year-old Alexis Murphy, began. About 30 friends and family members were present in the courtroom. Some of them wore pink t-shirts with photos of the missing girl. Additionally, parents of other victims, unrelated to this case, were also there. They had come simply to support the Murphy family, and their support came at the right time because Laura and Troy were unaware of many details of the investigation. Detectives had kept certain aspects of the case confidential, so the trial brought a severe emotional shock for Alexis's parents. When the prosecutor began discussing the physical evidence collected during the search and mentioned the pink top with bloodstains, Alexis's mother, Laura, nearly fainted. Until the very last moment, she had held on to hope that her daughter would be found alive. In her mind, she had created different scenarios. Maybe Alexis fell for the wrong person and ran away with him. Or maybe she had lost her memory and couldn't find her way home. But the blood on her child's clothing, this was something Laura had never prepared herself for. When the prosecution mentioned the ripped-out hair extensions and false eyelashes, the last thread of hope snapped for Laura. The broken fingernail and shattered cell phone only confirmed the grim reality. Alexis was gone. At the same time, this revelation brought a small sense of closure to her parents. Laura and Troy no longer clung to a miracle. At the very least, they knew their child was no longer suffering. The physical evidence contradicted Taylor's claims that Alexis and her friend had a fun time at his trailer and then left unharmed. The prosecution called witnesses, including employees from the Liberty gas station in Lovingston, who saw Alexis and Taylor talking for a while before getting into their cars and driving north, toward Taylor's trailer. A taxi driver also came forward. He had picked up Taylor after he had left Alexis's white Nissan Maxima near the movie theater in Charlottesville. Even though surveillance footage from the area didn't clearly show Taylor, the coincidence was too strange. He was there right around the time Alexis's car was abandoned. The jury was also shown footage of Taylor's first interrogation, where he denied being at the Liberty gas station on August 3rd or seeing Alexis Murphy. And then they watched as detectives exposed his lies. Throughout the trial, Taylor looked so overwhelmed that he ultimately chose not to testify in his own defense. He was facing a minimum of 20 years in prison, but the prosecutor pushed for the maximum, life imprisonment. And most importantly, in the state of Virginia, parole was abolished in 1996. This meant that if convicted, Taylor would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The only option left for Taylor was to try to file an appeal, which he did. Taylor argued that he had not received a fair trial. He insisted that the hearing should have been moved outside Nelson County because there was too much bias against him there. Taylor also claimed that he had a weak attorney who had not even managed to find witnesses to prove his innocence. However, his appeal was denied. Taylor attempted to appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court, but it was rejected there as well. Still, there were those who truly believed him. Some people supported Taylor's family and, as a result, were angry at Alexis Murphy, as if she were to blame for Taylor ending up behind bars, as if the girl herself was at fault for being taken from this world. This strange crowd tore down flyers with photos of the missing high schooler, even though her body had still not been found. It was a peculiar, small-scale protest. The search for Alexis continued for a long time after her disappearance. One day, a volunteer team of more than 150 people, including many members of the volleyball team that Alexis had captained in her lifetime, searched a 200-acre marshy area used for hunting in western Orange County. The terrain was difficult to navigate, and the searchers had to walk the entire route on foot. They examined every depression or irregularity in the ground, hoping to bring an end to the nightmare that Alexis's family continued to live through. Though the search ended without results, it actually brought a glimmer of hope to Lori and Troy. They believed that one day they would find Alexis, and the open wound in their hearts would begin to heal. On February 17, 2021, police announced to the public that the remains of 17-year-old Alexis Murphy, who had gone missing in August 2013, had been found, approximately 5 miles from where she was last seen alive. Her body was discovered only after Randy Taylor confessed to detectives where he had left her after strangling her. The inmate never revealed details about that August evening. In fact, Alexis had been found back in December 2020, but it took the forensic examiner about 2 months to fully identify what was left of her. Her parents were informed of the discovery on February 5th. Authorities gave the Murphy family time to come to terms with their loss without unnecessary questions and public attention. The news was shared with the public 2 weeks later. The police had kept their promise to bring the high schooler home. The Murphy family, friends, loved ones, law enforcement officers, former teachers, coaches, and members of the community all came to say their goodbyes. Instead of mourning speeches at the funeral, people reminisced about who Alexis was. They cried, laughed through their tears, and for the first time in a long while, her parents felt at peace. Their little girl was finally home, and now they could take care of her. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. They say love can work miracles, but it also makes people do crazy things, the finale of which can be someone's death. In today's story, we go back more than 30 years to the beginning of 1993, to Innisfail, a town located in Queensland in the northeastern part of Australia. Gabriel Meyer was born in 1976 and was the second child in the large family of Sherry and Doug. The Meyers had 6 children in total. Despite their number, all the siblings were very close to each other. Their mother, Sherry, was fully devoted to raising them and completely immersed herself in her family. Their father, Doug, was a boat builder and sometimes took the boys with him to work. At that time, the Meyers lived in Miami, Florida, where they were originally from. At some point, Doug decided to move his wife and children to a safer place. The crime rate in Florida during those years was very high, so the Meyers relocated to Australia, to the friendly and idyllic town of Innisfail, considering it the most suitable place for living and raising children. The family settled in a beautiful house right by the river, about a year and a half before the incident took place. Gabe grew up as an enterprising, active, and athletic young man. He was also described as a very mature and responsible individual, highly reliable and caring. Everyone who knew Gabe loved him and believed that he had a bright future ahead. It's not hard to imagine what his parents went through when their eldest son never came home one day. On January 12, 1993, it was just an ordinary Tuesday. School was on break, so 17-year-old Gabe decided to go to the gym for a workout that day. He asked his father to give him a ride, and since it was on Doug's way, he agreed. He dropped his son off at the local gym and went about his business, expecting to see Gabe again in a couple of hours. When Doug returned home for dinner, his son was still not there. The clock showed around 6:30 p.m. After waiting until 8 p.m., the family sat down for dinner, but Gabe still hadn't shown up. Doug and Sherry didn't think much of it at first. After all, Gabriel was a grown 17-year-old young man. That's the age when freedom and independence seem the most appealing. At first, the parents genuinely thought that maybe he had simply run into a friend, gotten caught up in conversation, and lost track of time. Sherry and Doug cleared the table, leaving dinner for their eldest son on the stove, and went to bed with the other children. They tried to relax and get at least some sleep, but in the end they didn't close their eyes all night. They kept listening for the sound of the door downstairs. Taking turns, they checked the boys' bedroom, reassuring themselves that if Gabe was late, there must have been a reason. As soon as he got home, he would explain everything. However, with each passing hour, their anxiety grew. The mother and father couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, and although Gabe was a responsible young man, he always made an effort to call and let his parents know if he was staying late at a friend's house. He never wanted to make them worry, but this time, it was different. The clock's hands moved relentlessly in circles, and the feeling of panic grew stronger with each passing minute. Doug and Sherry began to worry that their son might have been in an accident. Maybe he had been hit by a car and was now in the hospital. So the parents grabbed the phone and started calling local hospitals. They asked if a young man named Gabriel Meyer had been admitted, but none of the hospitals had any records of his hospitalization that evening. By morning, as soon as the sun rose, Doug and Sherry began calling Gabe's friends and classmates, still hoping that their son had spent the night at a friend's house. The first person they decided to talk to was a young man named Damon Kalanga. He was 26 years old, a bit older than Gabe. Despite the age difference, they were good friends. Damon had previously dated Gabe's older sister, Fawn, before she left for college. He cared about his health and maintained good physical shape. He and Gabe went to the same gym and often trained together. In fact, on January 12th, when Doug dropped his son off, Damon was already waiting for him at the gym. The young man confirmed that after their workout, he and Gabe briefly went up to his apartment. After that, Gabe had mentioned something about going to the Johnston River. It seemed like he wanted to go for a swim, but Damon didn't support the idea. Doug immediately found it very strange that his son would go swimming so late at night and alone. Nevertheless, he still headed to the pontoon to check if his son was there, but Gabe was nowhere to be found by the river. That was when Doug realized it was time to contact the police and file a missing person report. The investigation into Gabriel Meyer's disappearance began with detectives trying to learn more about the young man, who he was, who his friends and family were. There were several different theories about what could have happened to him. In most cases, teenage disappearances are linked to running away from home, but after looking into Gabe's family, officers couldn't find any reason why he would have wanted to leave. His loved ones adored him, never mistreated him, and always tried to support him in everything. So, the runaway theory was ruled out. The low probability of him running away was further reinforced by the fact that there had been no recent activity on Gabe's bank account. After his disappearance, his money remained untouched. A person without financial support from their parents would still need to spend at least some money for food, transportation, or accommodations. There was also no evidence that Gabe had used any form of public transportation. Police contacted local transport services and companies to check whether the teenager had taken a taxi or an intercity bus. There were no records confirming this. The next theory under consideration was an accident. Investigators began looking into whether Gabe could have drowned or been attacked by an animal. The Johnston River in North Queensland was known to be teeming with crocodiles, making it a dangerous place to swim. Based on the accident theory, police started searching the riverbanks, as crocodiles typically hide their prey under mangrove thickets. If Gabe had fallen victim to them, his remains might have been somewhere along the shore. However, this theory also seemed unlikely, as there were no traces of the teenager near the water, no signs of his presence, no fragments of clothing, or any other belongings from the day he went missing. From the very beginning, Doug and Sherry never believed in this version. Gabe wasn't reckless. He was fully aware of the dangers of the Johnston River. Moreover, he had grown up in Florida, where he frequently went to the beach with his family. He was a very strong swimmer and knew that any body of water could become unpredictable at night, let alone a river full of crocodiles. This raised another question. Could Damon Kalanga have lied about Gabe going for a swim that night? And if he had lied, could he have actually been involved in the teenager's sudden disappearance? That was what the police needed to find out. It didn't take investigators long to consider Damon Kalanga a suspect, not only because he appeared to be the last person to see Gabe alive, but also because the Kalanga name had already appeared in police records before. In 1991, just 2 years before Gabe Meyer's disappearance, Damon had been arrested for an attempted assault with intent to kill. He had attacked a young man named Paul Melling, intending to take his life. The crime was primarily fueled by Damon's rage over his ex-girlfriend, who had left him and started a new relationship with Paul. Damon was furious. He had quite literally lost his mind over the fact that she had chosen another man over him. He repeatedly begged her to come back, but it didn't work. His ex-girlfriend refused his advances and didn't even want to talk to him. That's when Damon decided to have a conversation with her new boyfriend. One evening in 1991, he asked Paul Melling to meet him so they could discuss the situation and sort things out. Paul agreed. The two young men drove to a quiet, secluded place. Seizing the moment when Paul turned his back, Kalanga pulled out a knife and tried to stab him. Fortunately, the blade slipped during the attack, cutting Damon's own hand and causing him to drop the weapon. Paul reacted quickly. He grabbed the knife from the ground and took off running down the road. Damon then jumped into his car and began chasing him at high speed. He intended to run Paul down, but the young man managed to jump out of the way just in time. He sprinted toward the nearest farmhouse, desperately seeking help. Terrified, Paul began pounding on the door. When the homeowner answered, Paul pleaded with him to call the police. Paul Melling survived the brutal attack, and Damon Kalanga was arrested and charged with attempted murder. However, for some strange reason, the charges were downgraded. Instead of facing charges for making a threat to life, he was convicted of attempted grievous bodily harm and reckless driving. His punishment? A mere 200 hours of community service, no prison time. Now, with Gabe Meyer missing and Damon being the last person to see him alive, police immediately became suspicious of him. They asked the young man to come to the station for questioning. Damon repeated the same story he had told Gabe's father. He and Gabe had worked out at the gym together. After that, they went to Damon's apartment, where he offered Gabe a protein shake. Both young men were very health conscious and physically active, and the shake was meant to help them recover their strength. This was around 5:30 p.m. Shortly after, Gabe started getting ready to leave and mentioned that he wanted to take a quick swim in the Johnston River. That, Damon claimed, was the last time he saw his friend. Damon's story was confirmed by two of his roommates. The young men said they had seen Gabe walk outside. About 15 minutes after he left, they went to the movie theater, leaving Damon home alone. With no evidence linking him to Gabe's disappearance and witness statements backing up his alibi, the police had no choice but to release him. Grief-stricken, Doug and Sherry Meyer turned to television, making a public appeal for any information about their missing son. This led to the police receiving multiple tips from different parts of Australia. Unfortunately, every lead turned out to be a dead end. About a week later, detectives received another tip, one that would prove to be quite significant. The call came from a teenage girl. She said that on the evening of January 12th, she had been at the Johnston River pontoon with her boyfriend. At around 7:30 p.m., they were walking near the river when they noticed someone's belongings on the shore. There was a gym bag, shoes, and a few other items. The young couple thought it would be funny to throw them into the water, so they did. They never even considered who the items might belong to. They just tossed them into the river for fun. Only later, when they heard about Gabe Meyer's disappearance on the news, did they realize that the belongings might have been his. It dawned on them that he could have drowned while swimming in the Johnston River. By discarding his items, they had inadvertently tampered with the investigation. With this new information, the police decided to conduct a thorough search of the riverbed. Before sending in divers, they first had to scare away the crocodiles using explosives. Once it was safe, a dive team entered the water in search of Gabe's belongings. Within minutes, they found a wristwatch, a pair of shoes, and a gym bag lying at the bottom near the shore. The recovered items were shown to Doug and Sherry, who confirmed that they belonged to their son. However, despite this new evidence, detectives were still not convinced that Gabe had drowned or fallen victim to a crocodile attack. The police suspected that something far more sinister had happened to him, something beyond a tragic accident. The issue was that Gabe's wristwatch resembled a diver's watch. It had two clasps designed to keep it securely fastened to the wrist. Because of this, investigators believed the watch couldn't have simply slipped off his hand. Either Gabe had removed it himself before swimming, an unlikely scenario, or someone else had unfastened the clasps and thrown the watch into the water. This raised an important question. Was this part of an attempt to cover up a crime or to create the illusion that Gabe had gone swimming and never made it back to shore? Even though Damon Kalanga's alibi was confirmed by his roommates, detectives still had lingering suspicions about him. After all, he was the one who told the police and Gabe's parents that Gabe had gone to swim in the Johnston River. This led to another critical question. What could have been the motive? Why would Damon want his friend dead? It soon became clear that the motive likely had something to do with Gabe's older sister and Damon's ex-girlfriend, Fawn Meyer. Fawn met Damon at the same gym where her brother worked out. Their relationship started with casual conversations. Soon, Damon began showering her with compliments. It was obvious that he liked her. Fawn found Damon to be sweet and charming, and a romance sparked between them. However, their relationship lasted only 3 weeks. That was because, after 3 weeks, Fawn left for the U.S. to attend college in Miami. Before moving to Australia, the Meyer family had lived in the United States, and Fawn still had many friends there. She planned to stay in Florida for at least 3 years. Fawn decided that she didn't want a long-distance relationship and told Damon as much. She didn't want to give him false hope, so she cut ties before leaving. However, in that short period, Damon had gotten to know Fawn's family and became close to them. He especially bonded with her younger brother, Gabe. The two shared many common interests, particularly in sports. Doug and Sherry liked Damon. He seemed kind, polite, and friendly. They saw how much he struggled with Fawn's departure. But Damon had become overly obsessed with Fawn, even though she had made it clear from the start that their relationship wouldn't last. Shortly before Christmas 1992, when it was time for Fawn to leave for college, just a couple of months before Gabe's disappearance, her parents took her to the airport. Damon came to see her off as well. The young man looked devastated, barely able to hold back tears. Because of this, even after Fawn left, the Meyer family continued to support Damon. They simply felt sorry for him. Doug and Sherry were so kind and generous toward him that they even invited him to their home for Christmas, even though in reality they barely knew him. They just assumed that he would eventually move on and adjust to Fawn's absence. But they were wrong. Damon had no intention of letting Fawn go. He couldn't stand the thought of her building a new life in America. He wrote her letters almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day. In his messages, Damon confessed his love for her, saying how much he missed her and how unbearable the separation was for him. And this was despite the fact that they had only dated for 3 weeks, with no serious commitments ever discussed. Damon constantly begged Fawn to come back. He insisted that she should be with him in Australia because she belonged to him and no one else. He even promised to pay for her flight if she returned to him. When his pleas were ignored, he resorted to deception, hoping to manipulate her into leaving school. Damon lied, claiming he had been diagnosed with throat cancer, and then started playing on her sympathy. However, Fawn wasn't naive. She quickly realized he was trying to manipulate her. Even though she was in another country, she felt emotionally and mentally pressured by her ex-boyfriend. 19-year-old Fawn Meyer had no desire to be with Damon any longer. She made it very clear that she had her whole life ahead of her and didn't want to spend it with him. Damon, however, was not the type to handle rejection well. He couldn't accept Fawn's refusal. He couldn't stand being rejected by women. One only had to remember what had happened to the new boyfriend of his previous ex-girlfriend to see that. Fawn's parents knew that Damon had been bombarding their daughter with letters, begging her to return. They were concerned, despite the fact that they had initially liked him. But they explained to their daughter that his behavior was an unhealthy obsession and that she needed to stand her ground. She had to tell Damon to stop writing and give up on trying to get her back. Otherwise, he might cause trouble in the future. No one could predict what an obsessed and rejected man might do. Fawn followed their advice. She firmly told Damon to stop writing to her because she had no intention of returning to Australia. She made it clear that she would only leave America if something happened to her family, if a relative got sick, or if something extraordinary occurred. In other words, only if her family truly needed her. With this, Fawn wanted to make it clear that she didn't see Damon as someone important in her life and had no intention of wasting her time on him. As soon as detectives heard about the comment Fawn had made to Damon Kalanga, they suspected that her words might have pushed the rejected man to take drastic action, such as kidnapping her younger brother. It was suspicious that shortly after that phone call, Gabe Meyer suddenly disappeared. Police theorized that Damon might have done something to the teenager in an attempt to force Fawn to return to Australia. The problem was, they had no solid evidence to support this theory. To get to the bottom of things, investigators decided to take a closer look at Damon's movements on the evening Gabe disappeared. According to Kalanga, on January 12th, after Gabe left his apartment to go to the river, he himself rented a car. He claimed that he needed to deliver a rug as a gift to his sister, who lived in the rural town of Tully, Queensland, about a 40-minute drive from Innisfail. He said he had driven about halfway there when a heavy rainstorm began. Kalanga decided that driving on country roads in a downpour would be inconvenient and unsafe. Plus, the rug was in the truck bed and could get soaked, so he simply turned around and drove back home. As a result, the rug was still sitting in his garage. Police confiscated it just in case, and to be honest, they were quite surprised by its condition. Damon told officers that he had intended to give the rug to his sister because he didn't need it. But the item was so dirty and tattered that it belonged in the trash rather than as a gift. It was strange that Damon had wanted to present it to a family member. The rug was covered in numerous stains, and at first, police suspected it might have been blood. However, forensic testing ruled that out. Next, they examined the rental car that Damon had used that night. Detectives suspected that he might have used the vehicle to transport Gabe's body, but there were no traces of Gabe found inside the car. What they did find, however, was a glaring inconsistency in Damon's story about that night. The odometer on the rental car showed that on January 12th, Damon had driven 69 kilometers. Detectives conducted an investigative experiment by driving the same route themselves. Their total distance came to just 61 kilometers, 8 kilometers less than what Damon had recorded. This suggested that Damon had likely gone somewhere else that night, somewhere he hadn't mentioned to the police, perhaps to a location where he had disposed of the body. Although highly suspicious, mileage alone wasn't enough to prove anything. It wasn't enough to charge Kalanga with a crime. As part of the investigation, forensic experts conducted a search of Damon's apartment. Once again, no signs of blood or a violent struggle were found. There was nothing to suggest that a crime had taken place inside the home. It was unclear how much longer investigators would have been at a standstill if not for a call from one of Damon's acquaintances who provided information about a strange location. The friend's name was James Potter. He explained to officers that about 2 weeks before Gabe disappeared, he and Damon had gone to a place called Plea Creek, a heavily forested area near Innisfail that resembled a tropical jungle. Deep in the woods at one particular spot, Damon had planted 2 sticks in the ground in the shape of a cross, saying he wanted to return there later. But what surprised Potter even more was that Damon had asked to borrow a shovel. James found his friend's behavior odd and decided to report it to the police. With this new information, detectives headed to the designated area in Plea Creek, not entirely sure what to expect. When they arrived, they indeed found the marked spot that Potter had described. Nearby, they discovered a large pile of palm leaves covering a hole in the ground. The hole was wide and deep enough to fit a human body. It looked like a grave. However, it was empty. And it wasn't the only one. Several smaller holes had been dug in the vicinity. Perhaps Damon had initially planned to hide Gabe's body there, but for some reason, he changed his mind and disposed of the remains elsewhere. When questioned by police about the purpose of the holes in Plea Creek, Damon didn't deny anything. He claimed that he had intended to use the area to grow marijuana for later sale. Although detectives found this explanation dubious, they had no concrete evidence against him, so they confronted him directly. Where was Gabe? Rumors were circulating that Damon was responsible for his disappearance. To this, Damon responded that the rumors were false, that he loved the Meyer family, and that he would never harm any of them. No matter what he said, too many aspects of his story simply didn't make sense. The holes in Plea Creek, the old rug, the extra mileage on the rental car, and his account of Gabe supposedly going for a late-night swim. Yet none of these details were enough to prove his guilt. That's when detectives had an idea. Only one person might be able to get Damon to tell the truth, and that was Gabe's older sister, Fawn. Investigators contacted Fawn, who was still in America, and asked for her help. The plan was for her to call Damon, ask him a few questions about her brother's disappearance, and hint that she wouldn't return to Australia until she found out what had happened to Gabriel. Fawn did exactly as she was asked. She called her ex-boyfriend and brought up the topic of her brother. She didn't want to accuse Damon directly, so she simply hinted that the sooner Gabe's body was found, the sooner she would book a flight home. Unfortunately, the plan didn't work. Damon didn't say a single word implying that he had anything to do with Gabe's disappearance. Police still held on to the hope that after the phone call, Damon might try to move the teenager's body, making it easier to locate. But that didn't happen either. Damon was under constant surveillance, yet he made no suspicious moves. It was another dead end. To the deep disappointment of his parents, Gabe's case soon began to fade into the background. For the Meyer family, it was a nightmare, a frustrating sense of helplessness. Everyone knew who was responsible for the teenager's disappearance. Yet, there was no concrete evidence linking Damon to the crime. It seemed as if he would get away with it. Doug and Sherry feared that their son would never be found, and that justice for him would never be served. At least, that's how things were for the first 2 weeks after his disappearance. But then, unexpectedly, there was a breakthrough. A woman living in a rural area near Innisfail called the police station. She reported that the night before, while walking around her property, she had noticed a foul smell. The stench was so strong it reminded her of a butchered pig left out under the scorching sun. As soon as the woman described the location where she had encountered the terrible odor, detectives became very interested in her discovery. Her neighbors were none other than Damon Kalanga's parents. Damon had lived in that area before moving out and getting his own apartment, meaning he was very familiar with the surroundings. 2 weeks after Gabriel Meyer's disappearance, the police finally had a promising lead. Detectives immediately rushed to the location described by the woman. After surveying the area, they quickly identified the source of the putrid smell. The spot was located near a highway. It was covered with a pile of leaves and tree branches, with a swarm of flies hovering above. It was clear that decomposing flesh lay beneath the foliage, attracting the insects. Officers cleared away the compacted leaves and began carefully digging. At a shallow depth, they quickly uncovered human remains. It was the body of 17-year-old Gabe Meyer. His corpse had been wrapped in a blanket, secured with a rope. His ankles, wrists, and hands were tied behind his back. The Meyer family finally received the tragic news. They were devastated. Until the very last moment, Gabe's parents had clung to the hope of a miracle. The woman who had reported the foul smell gave her statement to investigators. She recalled that on January 12th, the day Gabe disappeared, she had seen the headlights of a car driving down a dirt road toward the farmland where the teenager's body was later discovered. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention to the driver, but now, a week later, she was certain that the person behind the wheel was Damon Kalanga, someone she knew well. It appeared that he had been searching for a place to dispose of the body. The woman also remembered seeing Damon again a few days later, riding a bicycle near the same area where the remains were found. Now she believed that he had returned for a specific purpose, to better conceal the grave. That morning, as she passed by the location, she had no idea what lay beneath the ground. But when she walked past it again later, she noticed that a pile of leaves and branches had suddenly appeared in one spot. This meant that Damon had returned to the burial site and attempted to further cover it up with foliage. After discovering the teenager's body, police finally had the evidence linking Damon Kalanga to Gabe Meyer's murder. However, at first glance, the cause of the young man's death was unclear. There were no visible injuries on his body and no strangulation marks on his neck. When an autopsy was performed, the forensic pathologist found that, at the time of death, Gabe's system contained a mix of various medications. It was determined that these substances were commonly found in over-the-counter cold and flu tablets. The findings suggested that Gabe had ingested a large dose of these medications. The levels in his body were extremely high. The medical examiner concluded that after consuming a lethal amount of the pills, Gabe lost consciousness and soon passed away. During his initial interview, Damon told officers that before Gabe left his apartment, he had offered him a protein shake. Detectives believed that this was how Damon had poisoned him, with a deadly dose of medication mixed into the drink. He had likely crushed several packets of cold and flu tablets in advance and stirred the powder into the shake, ensuring that Gabe had no idea what he was actually consuming. Additional evidence supporting this theory came directly from a pharmacist who had sold the medication to Damon. Police checked local pharmacies, and at one of them, they found a receipt dated January 6, 1993. The signature on the receipt matched Damon's handwriting. The purchase? 2 boxes of cold and flu medicine. This receipt, with its specific date, played a crucial role in the case. It was discovered that on that very day, Fawn Meyer had called Damon and told him once and for all that it was over. She made it clear that he needed to stop contacting her and that she would only return to Australia in an absolute emergency. She had said this in an effort to make him finally leave her alone and accept that he had lost her forever. If only she had known how tragically her words would influence what happened next. It was a strange coincidence that just one day after that phone call with Fawn, Kalanga went to the pharmacy and purchased the same pills that were later found in the victim's system. And the evidence didn't stop there. After Gabe's body was discovered, an image of the blanket in which his remains were wrapped was made public. Damon's ex-wife then contacted the police, stating that the blanket once belonged to her. She explained that when she was married to Damon, they had bedding with a similar pattern. The rope used to bind the victim's hands and feet had previously been hanging in Damon's kitchen, but then it suddenly disappeared. His roommates confirmed that the rope had gone missing right after Gabe's disappearance. Since it was nowhere to be found in the apartment, it became clear that Damon had used it to tie up his friend before taking his life. Forensic experts carefully examined the blanket and found multiple fibers embedded in it. These fibers matched those from the roll of carpet in Damon's garage, the same carpet he had claimed he was planning to give to his sister. According to police, after Gabe was killed, his body was wrapped in the blanket and then further concealed inside the old carpet roll. The bundle was placed in the back of the rental car and transported to the area near Damon's parents' home, where Gabe was ultimately buried. This explained why no DNA, fingerprints, or blood traces were found inside the vehicle. With all of this evidence in place, 26-year-old Damon Kalanga was finally arrested for the murder of 17-year-old Gabriel Meyer. It was later revealed that before his arrest, Damon's sister, Deborah, had spoken to him about the tragic death of the teenager. She suspected that her brother was involved in the crime and pleaded with him to confess. Deborah told him that for once in his life, he needed to act like a man and tell the truth to the Meyer family. At that moment, something in Damon seemed to break. He admitted to Deborah that he was responsible for Meyer's death. However, he claimed that it had all happened by accident after Gabe had supposedly attacked him first. Damon said he panicked, got angry, and then, in a fit of rage, took the teenager's life. The only person he ever shared this version of events with was his sister, Deborah. But when detectives questioned him about it, he refused to discuss anything. Of course, because the police wouldn't have believed his story anyway. The crime had clearly been premeditated, so there was no point in trying to blame it on a moment of blind rage. When the case went to trial, Damon and his defense team attempted to argue that Gabe's death was an accident. In the end, Damon admitted that he was responsible for Gabe's death, but claimed that he never intended to kill him. However, the pharmacy receipt and the multiple dug-up graves of varying sizes at Plea Creek told a very different story. In fact, police had developed a chilling theory. They believed that Damon chose Gabe simply because he was the easiest to lure into his apartment and poison with a fatal drink. But the different-sized graves found in Plea Creek suggested something even darker. Damon may have considered other members of the Meyer family as potential victims as well. His obsession with getting Fawn back in Australia had consumed him to the point where he was willing to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. No one could know for sure what twisted thoughts had gone through the mind of a killer who took the life of a young man. For the jury, the prosecution meticulously pieced the case together and presented their own theoretical version of what had really happened on the day Gabe died. On the afternoon of January 12th, 1993, after Gabe and Damon finished their workout at the gym, they went together to Damon's apartment. Meyer stayed there for some time, just hanging out with his friend and Damon's roommates. Around 5:30 p.m., Gabe left the apartment. About 15 minutes later, Damon's roommates also left, heading to the movie theater. For some reason, Gabe returned. Perhaps he had forgotten something. It was at this moment that Damon prepared a protein shake for Gabe, lacing it with a large quantity of cold and flu tablets. Most likely, Damon's original plan was to take the drugged Gabe to the Plea Creek area, where he had pre-dug the graves, and finish him off there. However, Damon overdosed the teenager with so many pills that Gabe simply lost consciousness. Seizing the opportunity, Damon took advantage of his helpless state. During the autopsy, The medical examiner found a tiny piece of plastic stuck to the victim's face, part of a plastic bag. Both the police and the prosecution theorized that after the protein shake knocked Gabe unconscious, Damon placed a plastic bag over his head, causing him to suffocate. After Gabe's death, Damon tied his wrists and ankles, wrapped his body in a blanket, and secured it with a rope. Before that, he removed Gabe's watch, took his shoes and bag, and moved everything to the garage. Then he rolled Gabe's body inside the old carpet and placed it in the back of the rental car. That evening, Damon went to the Johnston River pontoon and left Gabe's belongings on the shore, creating the illusion that the teenager had gone for a late-night swim. When Damon returned to his car, he was unexpectedly approached by a neighbor. The man asked Damon to drive him to the pub and back. Afraid that refusing might raise suspicion, Damon agreed. The neighbor had no idea that the entire time, Gabe's lifeless body lay in the back of the car, wrapped in a carpet. After finally getting rid of the neighbor, Damon decided to bury Gabe near the location where investigators would later find his body. The reason he didn't take the body to Polly Creek, where he had already dug graves, was that it would have required carrying Gabe's body a long distance on foot through the dense forest. Driving to the intended burial spot simply wasn't possible. Originally, Kalanga had planned to take Gabe there while he was still semi-conscious, hoping the teenager would walk on his own. Now, however, he would have had to carry him entirely. Choosing a location near his parents' cottage, Damon quickly buried Gabe. Then he returned to his apartment. He did this to ensure he was home when his roommates came back from the movies, solidifying his alibi. Once that was secured, he got back in his car and returned to the burial site. There, he finished covering Gabe's body in a shallow grave. The next morning, Damon resumed his normal life, telling the fabricated story that Gabe had gone swimming that night and never returned. In February 1994, Damon Kalanga was found guilty of Gabriel Meyer's murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 13 years. Once eligible, the convicted killer repeatedly filed for parole, but each time, his request was denied. The fact that Damon remained behind bars for so long was largely thanks to Gabe's parents. Doug and Sherry Meyer fought tirelessly to ensure that Damon stayed in prison for the rest of his life, believing he remained a danger to society. Had Damon been properly punished after his first violent attack, rather than receiving community service, perhaps their son would still be alive today. Following Gabe's death, Doug and Sherry co-founded a victim support group in Queensland. The organization provides counseling for families of crime victims, helping them cope with the trauma of losing a loved one. However, Damon was ultimately granted parole and released just a few years ago. So far, he has not committed any new crimes, or at least none that have been reported. His release placed a heavy burden on the Meyer family. It's a cruel reality to know that the person who took your child's life is now walking free, enjoying the world your loved one never got the chance to. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. A young girl fell in love with a man old enough to be her father, but it turned out she wasn't the only one. 2 other wives lived with them. How do you think such a polygamous union could end? Of course, the woman felt like she was losing her mind. She didn't want to share her man with anyone else. Chloe just wanted these outsiders to disappear from their lives. When her husband, instead of handing over clean clothes for the child, threw a dirty shirt picked up from the floor in Chloe's face, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a butcher knife from the kitchen and locked herself in the room. The young woman knew exactly what to do. She just needed to rewind life, like in a movie. Chloe Driver was born in 2000. She grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, along with her siblings. According to her parents, Chloe was a pretty young girl who had a happy childhood. As a teenager, she did gymnastics, played softball, did well in school, and had lots of friends. However, Chloe had very different memories of her childhood. She said her parents were very cold toward her. Because the family constantly moved from place to place, she never really felt like she had a home. When Chloe became a teenager, she completely went off the rails. She rebelled against her parents, stopped trying in school, started abusing alcohol, got hooked on weed, and experimented with a wide range of illegal substances. Chloe got involved with boys, ran away from home, and then, after having her fun, would come back. She felt like her parents didn't care about her at all. They showed her no attention, no love, no care. As a teenager, Chloe began self-harming and hid the scars on her arms under plastic bracelets so her parents wouldn't see. One day, she even tried to take her own life by swallowing a handful of sleeping pills, but then she got scared and sought medical help on her own. In the end, she was prescribed mental health treatment and given medication. However, she took the medication inconsistently, so her condition remained far from stable. When Chloe turned 17, she ran away from home once again, and this time, she never went back. That was because she met a person who completely changed her life. This encounter turned out to be fateful. The runaway girl was very young, vulnerable, and had nowhere to live. At the same time, she was struggling with a destructive addiction. That was when a 38-year-old man named Brian Jones appeared in her life, also known as Benjamin Ben Michael. In fact, he had many names, but to avoid confusion, we'll refer to him as Brian. Hey friends, we need your support to help YouTube promote this video. Please give it a like now and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell so you don't miss new videos. When you finish watching, leave a comment with your thoughts on the case. Brian was born in 1979, but little is known about his childhood and youth. When he turned 33, he met a 17-year-old girl named Gabriella. Despite the fact that Brian was nearly twice her age, Gabriella fell in love with him almost instantly. Unlike her peers, he was very charming, showed care and attention, and made her feel special and loved. He was a textbook predator. Their relationship developed rapidly. Within just a few months, 17-year-old Gabriella moved in with Brian, who was still living with his parents at the time. That's when she discovered that the man of her dreams already had a long-term girlfriend. They had been together for 2 years and were even planning to get married. But at some point, things fell apart, and now Gabriella was Brian's only partner. As soon as the girl became emotionally attached to her boyfriend, their relationship took a sharp turn for the worse. Brian worked in some kind of investment group that he had created himself. However, his company resembled more of a multi-level marketing scheme. Although Brian considered himself a highly successful businessman, that was far from the truth. He barely made any money at all. However, having his own business only inflated his ego further. He delved into religion and started preaching his own ideas about spirituality. He saw himself as a kind of messiah, claiming to have a higher level of consciousness than ordinary people and genuinely believing he was superior to everyone else. It was during this time that he changed his name to Benjamin and tried to indoctrinate Gabriella into his beliefs. He spent entire days reading religious texts to her, and eventually, he succeeded in pulling her into his system of faith. His next step was to isolate the girl from everyone she knew. Brian imposed restrictions on who she could talk to, what she could discuss, how long she could speak, when she could go outside, and how she should behave. She was given a set of rules to follow, and over time, those rules became stricter. Brian took control of her social media accounts, monitored her every move, and gradually narrowed her circle of communication. The only person she was allowed to stay in touch with was her sister, Nicole. But even their conversations were heavily monitored. Gabriella had to speak on speakerphone so Brian could hear everything and instruct her on how to respond to certain questions. In reality, he often texted her sister pretending to be Gabriella, and eventually, he confiscated her phone altogether to prevent her from reaching out to anyone behind his back. What was once a romantic relationship quickly became an abusive one. Psychological and emotional abuse soon escalated into physical violence. For breaking his rules, Gabriella could be slapped, kicked, or shoved. The abuse reached extreme levels, bordering on torture. One day, Brian took duct tape and wrapped it around Gabriella so tightly that she began to suffocate, but even that wasn't enough for him. He then started beating her, leaving bruises all over her body. On another occasion, he dragged Gabriella into the basement, tied her up, held a machete to her throat, and gave her a detailed description of how he planned to end her life. At that moment, Brian's father, hearing noises downstairs, came down to see what was happening, only to end up as his son's hostage himself. Then, when Brian's mother came looking for her husband, she too was pulled into the nightmare. All three, Gabriella, his mother, and his father, were held captive by a man who had decided to control the fate of his loved ones as he pleased. For several hours, he kept them all tied up in the basement, threatening them with violence. It's unclear what Brian was trying to achieve. Eventually, he simply untied them and let them go. And the most astonishing part? He got away with it. None of the three captives went to the police. Gabriella remained trapped in this unbelievably abusive relationship. When she turned 18, Brian decided he was getting bored of her and now wanted a new girlfriend. He had never officially married Gabriella. He had simply declared her his wife. Naturally, she was unhappy with this turn of events. She didn't want a rival in the house and told Brian that directly. Brian gave her an ultimatum. If she wanted to remain his only wife, she had to get pregnant within the next 12 months. The young Gabriella had no desire to have children yet, but she was incredibly vulnerable and knew that if she refused, Brian would follow through on his threats and bring a new bride into their home. Feeling trapped in this bizarre relationship, Gabriella agreed, and it wasn't long before she became pregnant. During this period, Brian hardly touched his wife, except for one time when he nearly strangled her for daring to contradict him. The rest of the time, he limited himself to verbal abuse. However, he decided that pregnancy was the perfect time for the couple to adopt a nomadic lifestyle. With Gabriella already in the late stages of pregnancy, Brian packed their belongings into a van and set off on a journey across the country. They never stayed in one place for long. The constant traveling and bumpy rides caused discomfort and physical strain for the pregnant woman. But that wasn't even the worst part. Brian rejected traditional medicine. He forbade Gabriella from seeing doctors or visiting a clinic at all because, in his mind, it was all part of the corrupt system he refused to believe in. By the end of her pregnancy, the couple returned to Brian's parents' home, and he finally relented, allowing the birth to take place in a hospital. Fortunately, everything went smoothly without complications. Gabriella gave birth to a healthy baby girl. However, as soon as she and the newborn returned home, they were forced to hit the road again, living out of the van and continuing their nomadic lifestyle. After the birth of her daughter, something changed in Gabriella. Now she wasn't just responsible for herself, she had a little girl to protect. She wanted to keep her child safe at any cost. In reality, having a baby gave Gabriella a newfound sense of confidence, and she began looking for a way out of her relationship with Brian. This was no easy task, as she had lost almost all contact with her family and friends and was completely isolated, except for the rare occasions when she spoke to her sister Nicole. But even these conversations were closely monitored by Brian. Gabriella had no money. She was with the father of her child 24/7, and she had no way to escape unnoticed. On top of that, they were living in a van, and since the baby was being breastfed, she was relatively fine. But Gabriella herself was barely eating. Her body was severely weakened, and she didn't have the strength to even attempt an escape. Despite Brian's promises, the birth of their child did not stop him from bringing another wife into the picture. While traveling across the country in the van, he met another 17-year-old girl, Chloe Driver. In many ways, Chloe was similar to Gabriella. She had also run away from home in search of adventure and was in a particularly vulnerable state when Brian found her. He courted Chloe in the same way he had once courted Gabriella, charming her, making her feel special. He succeeded in winning her over, and soon, the three of them, Brian, Gabriella, and their baby, were traveling from city to city in the van, now with Chloe as part of their unsettling journey. At the beginning of 2017, just a few months after their daughter was born, Brian and his wives stopped at a friend's house. In a rare good mood, he allowed Gabriella to meet with her sister, Nicole, though only under his supervision. The reason he agreed to this meeting was that Brian wanted yet another wife, and Nicole seemed like the perfect candidate. He had always liked both sisters, and as soon as Nicole arrived, he immediately began trying to charm her. For Gabriella, this was the final straw. She absolutely refused to let her sister be dragged into the same insane world that had trapped her. She didn't want Nicole to become another one of Brian's victims. Her fear for her sister gave her the strength and courage she had been missing. The young mother grabbed her baby, took Nicole, and used the opportunity to escape to a farm in Florida. She hid there for about a month before Brian tracked them down and dragged her and the baby back. Even after being forced to return, Gabriella never stopped thinking about escaping. But Brian threatened that if she ever left again, he would take their child and file for sole custody. The naive young woman truly believed he would follow through with his threat, so she stayed by his side a little longer. Gabriella endured this abusive relationship for about 4 years, but one day, her patience finally ran out. Now that there were 2 wives in their household, Brian wasn't as vigilant in controlling them. Seizing the moment, Gabriella managed to call her father and ask for help. Only when her parents intervened was she finally able to break free from Brian's influence and breathe a sigh of relief. However, for several more years, Brian continued trying to meet with her and influence her decision. He was furious that she had abandoned him. But one person was happy that Gabriella was gone. That person was Chloe. Now, she was getting more attention from the man she loved. But that didn't last long. Things quickly took a turn for the worse. After Gabriella escaped, the van traveling across the country now held only Brian and Chloe. And the once charming, attentive man who had promised to love her forever soon revealed his true nature, a cunning manipulator and an aggressive abuser. Chloe struggled with mental health issues and had a substance abuse problem. She had run away from her parents' home because she felt unloved by her mother and father. The arrival of Brian in her life turned her world upside down. He was caring, attentive, and made her feel special. Chloe fell for him instantly, despite the fact that he was old enough to be her father. For the first time, she felt truly safe and protected. But as soon as she let her guard down, everything changed. Brian revealed his true nature. Just as he had done with Gabriella, he began isolating Chloe from the few close people she had in her life. He forbade her from contacting her family, friends, or acquaintances. Any communication with others was strictly monitored. Then, Brian escalated to physical and emotional abuse. The cycle repeated itself, only this time with a different girl. After about a year of being with Chloe, Brian decided she was no longer enough for him. He still wanted multiple wives. And soon, he got his wish. 2 more women joined the van. One was 30-year-old Jessica, and the other was 20-year-old Sarah. Brian met them during one of their stops in a small town. He had a way of being charming and persuasive, and he managed to convince them to join his group. Before long, both lonely women had moved into the motorhome. The self-proclaimed spiritual leader declared Sarah and Jessica his new wives and continued his travels. Now, they were all living together in the van. Most likely, Brian never legally married any of the women. Instead, he simply created his own version of a polygamous union. And while polygamy is illegal in the United States, that didn't stop Brian from introducing all 3 women as his wives to everyone they met. To prevent a repeat of Gabriella's story, and further tighten his grip on his wives. Brian drafted a contract and forced Chloe, Jessica, and Sarah to sign it. The document outlined how they were expected to behave and the punishments they would face if they violated the terms. Brian also gave all his wives new Hebrew names. Chloe became Kwani, Jessica was renamed Anna Gamani, and Sarah was now called Shelik. As for himself, Brian started calling himself Z. It's unclear what the internal dynamics of their relationship were really like, but on social media, Brian posted pictures of himself embracing all three women, and they appeared to be happy. According to one of Brian's former friends, there was never any jealousy between the women, and they all got along well. At least that's how it seemed from the outside. That friend was Jason Spillers. He and Brian bonded over their shared interests in investment business, as well as their belief that they were superior and more intelligent than others. Both men had a clear God complex and took pride in their perceived superiority. Their close friendship began when Brian introduced Jason to his bizarre spiritual beliefs, which Jason eagerly absorbed. Brian convinced his friend that he was chosen, and that if Spillers followed him, he would achieve greatness. Eventually, a fifth member joined the cult, moving into the trailer and adopting the same nomadic lifestyle as the rest of the group. But what exactly were these followers expected to believe? First, Brian forced them to follow a strict vegetarian diet. Second, he completely rejected modern medicine. The cult members were taught that they had to heal themselves, no matter what happened to them. On top of that, Brian introduced a practice of sensory deprivation, where he would confine his followers, sometimes individually, sometimes in pairs, in a room with no light and minimal sound. They were forced to remain in darkness for hours, meditating, without permission to even use the bathroom. But the most disturbing practice of all was urine consumption. Brian forced his followers to drink their own urine, claiming it had incredible health benefits. Naturally, as the cult leader, Brian believed that men should have multiple wives. At the time, he had 3, but he wanted more. Jason was also granted the right to have multiple wives, but at that point, he didn't have any, because Chloe, Sarah, and Jessica were already married to Brian. Both men viewed women as inferior beings, less than human, and treated them accordingly. Jason even expressed these views publicly on social media. He wrote that women were psychologically weaker than men and should be kept in cages. According to him, women were only capable of destroying what men built. He referred to the opposite sex as narcissistic and deceitful creatures. The only thing a woman could do that a man couldn't was give birth to a child, but some ladies weren't even capable of that. Jason, Brian's friend, also made a list of male superiority. He believed that women were incapable of taking responsibility, making logical decisions not based on emotions and flawed reasoning, properly leading a group of people or a community, ensuring the safety and protection of a family, thinking independently without succumbing to herd instinct, or being sincere. And these thoughts were expressed by a man who, at his friend's command, had been drinking his own urine for several years. The most astonishing part was that at least a few points on the list literally described Jason himself. It was Jason who had no opinion of his own. It was Jason who followed the herd instinct, obeying Brian. He was incapable of leading. The 3 women in the cult were treated exactly as Jason had described in his social media posts. They were oppressed, forbidden from having their own opinions, and not allowed to make any decisions. Sarah, Jessica, and Chloe were responsible for cooking, cleaning, and recruiting new wives. Everything else was decided by the men. But in reality, the only significant decisions were about which direction their van would travel. The funniest part was that Brian and Jason genuinely believed themselves to be chosen ones. Their egos were inflated, and they saw themselves as equal to God. But in truth, they were just 2 arrogant, pompous narcissists trying to elevate themselves at the expense of women. Sarah, Chloe, and Jessica were under the complete control of these 2 self-absorbed men. Brian was known for his cruelty toward those close to him, but Jason was no better. In 2017, before Jason joined the cult, he attended a youth festival and started harassing college girls who were much younger than him. The students tried to stay away from Jason because, to put it mildly, he was strange. After several failed attempts to start a conversation with anyone, he became enraged and began threatening the college girls with violence. Then he tracked some of them down on social media and started stalking them. For years, he continued to threaten them, blackmail them, and sometimes even showed up on their campuses trying to attack them. When his online threats didn't work, he turned his attention to the students' families, sending them vile messages. The girls and their parents reported him to the police, but the authorities did nothing about Jason's behavior. For a year, Brian's cult members traveled across the country in their van, occasionally staying at friends' houses. And then, something significant happened. Chloe, the first of the wives, became pregnant. Of course, this news greatly delighted Brian. Ever since Gabriella had escaped from him, taking their daughter with her, he had dreamed of each of his wives giving him a child. He saw this as a way to strengthen his control over the women. Just like with Gabriella, Chloe was not allowed to see doctors. She didn't register her pregnancy, and she even had to give birth without medical assistance in a random house where their van had stopped. Fortunately, there were no complications. The baby girl was named Hannah Nicole Driver. After giving birth to her daughter, Chloe's life changed. She hadn't expected to love the little girl so deeply from the very first seconds. Her views also began to shift. Before, she had relied entirely on Brian, never questioning his decisions. But now she started to rebel, because she was responsible for a tiny girl who had become the meaning of her life. The mother worried that her child wouldn't be able to develop properly in such conditions. Chloe was also concerned for her daughter's safety, which led her to question many of Brian's destructive and degrading beliefs and behaviors. She was frustrated that he refused to allow medical visits or necessary vaccinations. More than anything, she was worried about the infant's health. Because Hannah had been born in a random house, she didn't even have a birth certificate. She was completely off the grid. If anything happened to the baby, Chloe wouldn't even be able to prove that the little girl had ever existed. At some point, the young mother began to feel that everyone around her wanted to harm her. She started distancing herself from the two other women living in the van, stopped talking to Jason, and began pulling away from Brian. This did not sit well with the cult leader. Sensing that he was losing control over one of his wives, Brian began to punish Chloe harshly. He constantly abused her both physically and emotionally. Chloe was forbidden not only from speaking to outsiders, but even from greeting them or simply waving. She wasn't allowed to go to the store for groceries or take walks around the city. She couldn't get a job or obtain a driver's license. She was only allowed to use her phone in rare cases and always under her husband's strict supervision. The young woman felt completely alone, as if she would never escape the cult and never be able to live independently. To make matters worse, Brian knew exactly how to break her. If she disobeyed, he threatened to take full custody of Hannah. Over time, Chloe's situation grew worse and worse. Her already fragile mental health suffered due to the isolation, and the worse she got, the more Brian punished her. She was forced to undergo what Joyce called dark therapy. Chloe was locked in a pitch-black room, completely alone, chained to a bed, and not even allowed to use the bathroom. She had no choice but to relieve herself where she lay. When she emerged into the light, Chloe experienced hallucinations and began confusing fantasy with reality. Each time, her behavior became more erratic. Sometimes her aggression would spike to dangerous levels, and she would lash out at someone in the group for no apparent reason. But the moment she met resistance, she would start trembling and retreat into herself. Her gaze would drift, as if she had left her body and entered another reality. Out of nowhere, she would suddenly start screaming. Much of what she shouted was about her daughter, Hannah. The young mother believed the other wives wanted to harm her child. As a result, Brian and Jason often had to physically restrain Chloe until she calmed down. Chloe herself couldn't explain these sudden outbursts. She simply had no memory of them. In reality, she desperately needed urgent medical treatment. But because the cult members rejected modern medicine, Chloe never sought help. Brian took it upon himself to cure his wife's episodes, but her paranoia only grew stronger with each passing day. In 2020, the cult leader allowed Chloe to visit her family. He hoped it would somehow improve her condition and make her calmer. But that didn't happen. When Chloe's mother saw her daughter in such a horrific state, she was in shock. Chloe had lost a significant amount of weight since giving birth, and her eyes were lifeless. She looked more like a zombie than a happy young mother. A bruise had formed under her eye, clear evidence of Brian's physical abuse. Chloe's mother tried to bring her daughter back home, but she refused. She no longer knew where she truly belonged. However, the visit to her childhood home made one thing clear: she no longer wanted to be part of the cult. The young woman made several attempts to escape with baby Hannah in her arms, but each time, Brian or Jason stopped her. Chloe was reliving Gabriella's story all over again. But unlike Gabriella, her story, unfortunately, would not have a happy ending. In November 2020, Chloe managed to escape from the van and ran into the middle of the road. She waved her arms frantically, trying to stop passing cars. When one vehicle slowed down, the desperate woman rushed to the driver's window and began pleading for help. She screamed that she needed a phone to call the police and her mother because she and her daughter were in danger. The driver, a woman named Sandra, barely had time to react before two men suddenly appeared, Jason and Brian. They grabbed Chloe and began dragging her back toward the van parked on the roadside. The scene looked like a kidnapping. Sandra tried to intervene, but Jason simply walked up to her and punched her in the face. The result: a broken eye socket and a trip to the hospital for the innocent bystander. Meanwhile, Chloe was forced back into the van. After this incident, Chloe's mental health deteriorated rapidly. Her paranoia spiraled completely out of control. She became convinced that everyone was conspiring against her. She recorded a video on her phone, detailing how she was being held captive, how they had taken her daughter away from her, and how she was not allowed to see the baby. Chloe also started believing she could read other people's thoughts. She claimed that her husband, Brian, along with the other two wives, Jessica and Sarah, were plotting to take her life and Hannah's life as well. She believed the cult was performing dark magic rituals against her. Chloe became convinced that she was living in sin because she was married to a man who had two other wives. And in her mind, this sin was being passed down to her daughter through her breast milk. Around this time, one of Chloe's brothers was killed in a shooting. Now, she believed that God was punishing her for her sins, that she was personally responsible for the death of her loved one. Chloe also began sharing deeply disturbing stories about her childhood with the cult members. She claimed that at the age of 9, she had been assaulted by her own brothers. She later told everyone that her older brother was involved in drug trafficking and that she had been using white powder regularly since she was 10 years old. Chloe also complained that her parents had treated her harshly as a child, locking her inside a closet as punishment. As Chloe told these stories, she went into vivid, unexpected details. It was impossible to tell what was true and what was the product of her increasingly delusional mind. It was clear that she was suffering from paranoid delusions and could have easily fabricated all these horrors. One thing was undeniable: Chloe needed immediate treatment. Under normal circumstances, she would have gone to a doctor, received a diagnosis, and been prescribed medication, therapy, or some other form of help. But because Brian's cult rejected modern medicine, her condition deteriorated by the day. On the night of November 20th, Chloe's downward spiral reached its breaking point. She approached Brian and tried to convince him that Sarah, Jessica, and Jason had to go. They weren't real people, she insisted. They were hired actors sent to ruin their lives. When Brian refused to get rid of the others, Chloe was consumed by a wave of despair, her mind completely unraveled. She became convinced that everything around her was fake, an illusion, and that, just like in a movie, she could simply rewind to an earlier time, a time before the other wives, before Jason. But in order to return to the past, she first had to die. Chloe frantically searched the internet for ways to take a life in the name of salvation. She looked up methods to break a neck, inflict fatal injuries, and how to resurrect in another reality afterward. Her disturbing searches led her to various websites filled with horrifying information, which only pushed her further into the abyss. In Chloe's mind, the only way to save herself and her child from this strange, twisted cult was to end it all. At the beginning of December, Joyce's group stayed at the home of acquaintances in Canton, Georgia. On December 8, 2020, Chloe was already in an incredibly fragile state. That day, she was taking care of Hannah and asked her so-called husband, Brian, to bring clean clothes to change the baby. The man picked up the first shirt he saw from the floor and threw it at Chloe and the child. At that moment, the woman felt completely unworthy of life. After months of paranoid delusions, the shirt thrown in her face became the last straw and pushed her to the very edge. Chloe went to the kitchen, took a butcher knife, and locked herself in a bedroom on the second floor of the house with her 13-month-old daughter. Tormented by anxious thoughts, the woman did not even realize what she was doing. Without thinking, she plunged the knife into Hannah's neck several times, then collapsed onto the mattress and pressed the blade to her own throat. Chloe wanted to die with her daughter so that they could be reborn together. Brian and other members of the group heard something happening in the room upstairs. They tried to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. When Brian kicked the door open, it was already too late. Hannah, struggling to breathe, was making a gurgling sound. She was covered in blood. Chloe was lying unconscious on the floor. Suddenly, Brian let out a heart-wrenching scream. He never expected that the rebellious girl would go this far. He had always thought her antics were just a way to get attention. While he tried to press on Hannah's neck wound, his friend Jason ran to Chloe and attempted to bring her back to consciousness. At that moment, she was in a borderline state, drifting in and out of consciousness. When her eyes cleared, she quietly begged Jason to let her die. While the men were providing aid to the victims, one of the wives, Jessica, rushed to the phone and called emergency services. Baby Hannah was urgently transported to the hospital by ambulance. In the intensive care unit, doctors did everything in their power to save the little girl. But the wounds were too severe. One of the blows had pierced her spine. There was nothing more they could do, and at 3:10 p.m., Hannah Nicole Driver was pronounced dead. The girl lost her life as a result of a vicious attack by her own mother, and it was simply incomprehensible. Chloe was also rushed to the hospital, and unlike her daughter, she survived. The police tried to question the woman about what had happened, but her injuries were so severe that she was practically unable to speak. She had to respond in writing, and the first thing Chloe asked was to be taken to her daughter because Hannah was still so little and couldn't manage without her mother. At that moment, the officers had to deliver the devastating news. Her daughter did not survive. When asked if Joyce was to blame for this, the woman shook her head and wrote that she had done it herself. Then she added that she was losing her mind and no longer wanted to share Brian with his friends and other wives. She wanted to be the only one, but her husband did not listen to her. Brian Jones simply had no intention of giving up his polygamous lifestyle. After Chloe recovered from her injuries, she was placed in custody while awaiting trial. However, she didn't even try to use her time in jail to distance herself from her so-called husband, from whom she had once desperately wanted to escape. Instead, when she was allowed to make a phone call to her mother, she contacted Brian. During the phone conversation, her husband was very reserved, but he still continued to manipulate Chloe. He told her to keep drinking her own urine even in prison, and the woman actually followed his instructions, though she was ashamed to do it in front of her cellmates. Brian also forbade her from saying anything bad about him during the trial. While Chloe was in jail, she made about 600 phone calls to Brian, using every opportunity to dial his number. Meanwhile, the leader of the polygamist cult continued to enjoy his nomadic lifestyle with his 2 remaining wives. He was not charged with any crimes. On his social media, Brian announced that both of his wives were pregnant and that he would soon become a father again. Jason Spillers, a friend and follower of Joyce, continued to harass several college students and their families. In light of the Chloe Driver case, the police finally took notice of this man. They reviewed all the complaints from potential victims and issued a warrant for Jason's arrest. It turned out that he had escalated from making threats to taking action. In an attempt to kidnap a girl, he found out her address and showed up at her home. When he was not let inside, Jason slashed the tires of a car parked in the driveway and spray-painted the vehicle. Jason fled, but he was tracked down, arrested, and put behind bars. In November 2024, the trial of Chloe Driver, who had taken the life of her own daughter, was recently held. Throughout the trial, there was no doubt that the woman had committed the crime. However, the question remained whether she was sane at the time. The defense argued that Chloe should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution, on the other hand, stated that Chloe had carried out the killing deliberately to become Brian's only wife. Various witnesses testified throughout the trial, aiming to shed light on the crime. Among them was Brian's first wife, Gabriella, who shared her painful experience of being in a relationship with him. The trial lasted 6 days, during which the jury listened to testimony from 21 witnesses and reviewed shocking crime scene photos before being sent to deliberate Chloe's fate. The young mother remained expressionless as her verdict was read. The jury found Chloe guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but mentally ill on all counts. This meant that they rejected the defense's claim of insanity and held the woman criminally responsible for her actions. The sentencing of Chloe Driver, who sent her 13-month-old daughter to the afterlife, will take place in December of this year. Until then, she will remain in custody at the Georgia Department of Corrections. According to the latest reports, Brian Joyce has also been arrested, but authorities have not yet disclosed the charges against him. Did this young woman commit the crime without understanding what she was doing, or was this her way of proving something to her husband? If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. Do children really pay for the sins of their parents? Is the boomerang effect real? And is it true that fate gives villains an ironic chance to end up in the place of their own victims? They also say that women look for a husband who resembles their father. But what if their father is a serial maniac? Today, we will hear an absolutely wild story that began with the disappearance of Melissa Wolfenbarger. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. The last time Melissa's mother, Norma, spoke with her on the phone was on November 26, 1998, on Thanksgiving. They discussed the upcoming Christmas together, gifts, and weekend plans. Melissa, along with her husband and 2 children, was planning to visit her parents for the holiday. However, when Christmas arrived, neither their daughter nor her husband and grandchildren showed up at the house. Norma and Carl knew that Melissa would never miss spending the holidays with her family. And even if there had been a serious reason, the young woman would have certainly called her parents to let them know that her plans had changed. This time, things were different. At that moment, there was little the parents could do, as Melissa was an adult 21-year-old woman. She was married to her high school sweetheart, Christopher Wolfenbarger, and was raising 2 small children, 3-year-old Christina and 2-year-old Joey. The couple lived with their little ones in a duplex in Atlanta. For the holidays, they were supposed to come to Melissa's family home in Locust Grove, Georgia, where she had spent her childhood. During their phone conversation about Christmas, Melissa had asked her mother for pictures of herself with her grandmother. Norma promised to buy a beautiful frame, place the photos inside, and put the gift under the Christmas tree for her daughter. Unfortunately, Melissa would never get to see her parents' gift. It remained wrapped under that tree for a long time. It was 1998 and mobile phones were still not a common thing. That's why Melissa's parents and other members of the Patton family kept trying to reach her for a long time, but there was no response. In January, Norma and Carl could no longer bear the strange silence, so they got in their car and drove to their daughter's home in Atlanta, desperate for answers to the questions that haunted them. When they arrived at the duplex on Brooklyn Avenue, they found it empty. The apartment had been completely cleaned out, as if no one had ever lived there. A deeply worried Norma went to speak with the neighbors and learned that her daughter's family had moved out. One of the neighbors recalled hearing them loading their belongings sometime between Christmas and New Year's, but the Wolfenbargers hadn't left a forwarding address, a note, or any kind of warning. The entire family had simply vanished. Norma and Carl weren't about to give up so easily. They tracked down the company where they believed their son-in-law, Christopher, had been working and headed there. It was a glass company. At the office, they were told that Christopher had actually been fired after crashing one of the company's trucks. According to their records, he had worked there from October 1998 until sometime in 1999, so the management had no idea where he was now. Melissa's parents had no choice but to return home empty-handed. In February, Norma's birthday came, and she held on to hope that her daughter would call to wish her well, but that call never came. That was the moment Norma realized that something terrible had happened to Melissa. She was devastated by the realization that her little girl would never come home again. Melissa Patton Wolfenbarger was born on September 9, 1977, and grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, alongside her older sister, Tina Patton. She was always cheerful, kind, and trusting. She loved animals and would bring home every kitten and puppy she found in the neighborhood. In the future, Melissa dreamed of becoming a veterinarian and rescuing four-legged pets. She and Tina participated in school beauty pageants and were very close. Melissa's kindness and trustfulness remained with her as she grew older, but they were soon joined by teenage rebellion. As a result, she ran into trouble with the law over minor offenses. She would sneak out of her bedroom window to go to parties with boys. These rebellious acts eventually led Melissa to fall in love with a boy who didn't make the best impression on her parents. But the high schooler was in a hurry to grow up, so she married her high school sweetheart, Christopher, and moved to the city with him. After marriage, things quickly fell into place. By the time she turned 21, Melissa was a proud mother of 2 children and enjoyed her role as a married woman. But in the winter of 1998, everything changed. That was when the young woman suddenly disappeared, never to be seen again. Her parents searched for their youngest daughter in hospitals, morgues, and even local jails. They knew that Melissa had worked at a bakery for some time alongside her older sister, Tina, but the management told them that she hadn't shown up for work in over a month. They had no information about her getting another job. One day, she simply didn't come to work and never warned anyone. Her co-workers went to check on her at home, but the neighbors told them that Melissa's family had moved away. Throughout 1999, there was no sign of the young woman. Her mother and father prayed that their daughter was alive and would return home. They clung to the hope that Melissa had a good reason for not calling her parents. After months of waiting and conducting their own search, in January 2000, Norma Patton officially filed a missing person report. When she reached out to the police, Atlanta detectives were able to track down Christopher Wolfenbarger, Melissa's husband. But his wife was not with him. Neither were their children. Christopher claimed that Melissa had left to pursue her dream. According to him, she had long wanted to start a new life in California, so one day she simply disappeared. But Norma and Carl were 100% sure that their daughter would never abandon her children. Something was clearly wrong. However, since her husband had never reported her missing, and Melissa was an adult woman who didn't have to account for her actions to her parents, the police didn't give her disappearance the attention it deserved. Moreover, the case itself posed a major challenge. There was no crime scene, nor any evidence that anything had happened to Melissa. Her husband, Christopher, insisted that she had been planning her move to California for a long time. He claimed that she had been working double shifts at the bakery to save more money, and that sometimes she even booked a hotel room so she wouldn't have to drive home after a long shift. Then one day, she simply didn't come home. At first, Christopher assumed she would return later, but when she still didn't show up the next day, he figured she had decided to follow through on her plan and had gone to California alone. So, according to Christopher, there was nothing unusual about her disappearance. Investigators tried to pressure him, bringing up his criminal past, but Christopher dismissed it as old news. He claimed that he and his wife were like Bonnie and Clyde, just on a much smaller scale. He admitted that they had been a little wild in their youth, even before their marriage. However, as it later turned out, that wasn't entirely true. Melissa had actually reported Christopher to the police and accused him of domestic violence. According to her, he had repeatedly hit her. On one occasion, he allegedly drugged her and then dragged her down the street by her hair. In response to Melissa's accusations, Christopher filed a counterclaim. At one point, she packed her things and left to stay with her sister. But a week later, she returned for her children. Their relationship was unstable. But when a judge reviewed their case, Christopher asked for a private conversation with his wife. After a brief discussion, Melissa withdrew her complaint and returned to him. After all, they had 2 children to raise. When his wife unexpectedly left for California, Christopher moved out of the duplex and went to stay with relatives, while he sent the children to live with his mother. As a result, Christina and Joey now lived with their grandmother, and their father visited them only occasionally. Since the children were still very young, they quickly forgot about their mother. They only remembered their father when Chris came to his mother's house. Norma Patton stated that she had never liked Melissa's husband. She believed it was because of him that her daughter ran away from home as soon as she finished high school and rushed into marriage. Melissa's older sister, Tina, recalled noticing a handprint on Melissa's neck once. Melissa burst into tears and begged her not to tell anyone. Tina's boyfriend had a man-to-man talk with Christopher, and that was the end of it. Regardless, Carl and Norma Patton never believed that their daughter would just run away without telling anyone, and even if she had, she would have found a way to contact her parents. However, as time passed, there was still no clarity about what had happened to Melissa. A young woman, a mother of 2 small children, had simply vanished into thin air. Strangely enough, in 2000, during questioning, Christopher Wolfenbarger told authorities that he had seen Melissa outside their home in March or April of 1999. But earlier, he had claimed the last time he saw her was in December 1998. Despite this contradiction, Melissa's disappearance remained unresolved. 5 years later, in 2003, her family found itself in the spotlight once again. But this time, it wasn't because of Christopher. Instead, it was Carl Patton, Melissa's father, who ended up behind bars. Back in mid-1983, Carl had been arrested on theft charges. He served a short sentence and was later granted parole. After that, Patton was never involved in criminal activity again and had never been arrested. But it turned out that he had committed another crime back in 1977, and it wasn't uncovered until more than 20 years later, after DNA evidence finally proved his involvement. On February 23, 2003, Carl Patton was arrested for the murder of 31-year-old Liddy Matthew Evans. She had been living with a man named Joe Cleveland, who was Carl Patton's best friend. Liddy's body was found in a river, stuffed inside a sleeping bag and chained to a concrete block. She had been shot in the head, and this wasn't the only crime Melissa's father had committed. Just minutes after Carl's arrest, his wife, Norma, announced that she was willing to testify against him in exchange for immunity from prosecution. A plea deal was made between her and the district attorney's office, and Melissa's mother gave incriminating testimony against her husband. According to Norma, between 1970 and 1977, Carl Patton and his friend, 28-year-old Joe Cleveland, committed a series of crimes. First, Carl and his friend shot and killed Carl's own uncle, 45-year-old Fred White, and Fred's girlfriend, Betty Jo Eflem. A month later, Carl told his wife that Joe had broken their agreement and had talked about the murders to mutual acquaintances. Carl convinced Norma to help him get rid of his loose-lipped friend, who could cause serious trouble for their family, and she agreed. According to Norma's testimony, on December 17, 1977, Carl lured his best friend, Joe, and Joe's girlfriend to their house, where he shot them both on the couch with a shotgun. The Pattons wrapped the bodies in sleeping bags, attached weights, and dumped them into the river. Afterward, Norma cleaned the house, washed away the blood, and destroyed any evidence. Carl burned the blood-stained couch in the backyard. The only thing Norma forgot was to clean the trunk. The bodies were found in the river a few days later. The Pattons were questioned, as they were among the suspects in the killings, especially after bloodstains were discovered in their van's trunk. Although the blood type matched that of Liddy Evans, there wasn't enough evidence to charge Carl at the time, so authorities had to let him go. It wasn't until late 2002 that another DNA test was conducted, and this time, Carl Patton's involvement in the crime was undeniable. On February 23, 2003, he was arrested at his own home. It turned out that the father of missing Melissa Wolfenbarger was a serial killer, someone who had no trouble taking the lives of his best friend, a family member, or their partners. So it wasn't hard to suspect that this man could have easily killed his own daughter. Perhaps she had seen something, or was planning to turn him into the police. Law enforcement officials also suspected Carl's involvement in Melissa's disappearance. However, he was never charged with her murder. According to Carl, he would never take the life of an innocent person. He claimed that he only eliminated those who posed a threat to his family. Still, many believed that Melissa had become Carl Patton's fifth victim. There were also theories linking her disappearance to the mafia that had operated in the southern United States since the 1960s. This criminal organization was known for carrying out contract killings, especially against former members. Rumors circulated that Carl Patton had ties to this mafia group. Some believed he was a skilled hitman, though Carl himself denied these claims. The first trial against Melissa's father took place in March 2003, focusing on the murders of Fred White and his mistress, Betty Jo Eflem. Norma explained that Carl and Joe had killed them for financial gain. Fred's legal wife had taken out a life insurance policy on him because he had been cheating on her with Betty. She then hired Carl, promising him a large sum of money to get rid of her unfaithful husband. After committing the crime against his own uncle, Carl later claimed to have regretted it. He pleaded guilty to the charges against him. He was sentenced to 2 life terms with the possibility of parole after 20 years. He was then transferred to another county, where the trial began for the murders of Liddy Evans and Joe Cleveland. Once again, Carl pleaded guilty and received 2 more life sentences. His wife, Norma, effectively admitted to being guilty of failing to report the crimes and of destroying evidence. She was sentenced to 12 months of probation and fined $1,000. Detective Bruce Jordan had been the one investigating Carl Patton's old cases. After 25 years, he managed to track down and imprison a serial killer. And now, the convicted murderer turned to him with a request to find his missing daughter, Melissa Wolfenbarger. Carl considered Jordan a true professional, believing that if he had been able to catch a criminal after a quarter of a century, he might also be able to find Melissa. The Patton family had always been certain that Carl could never have taken the life of his youngest daughter. He loved his girls and was devastated when he learned about her disappearance. Melissa's sister, Tina, and her mother, Norma, believed that someone else was responsible for her vanishing. Detective Bruce Jordan took on the Wolfenbarger case. After news of the reopened investigation was published in the newspaper, he received a tip from the Atlanta morgue. An examiner called him to report that they had been storing unidentified remains for the past 4 years. It turned out that back in April 1999, a severed head had been discovered near the area where Melissa's family had lived. Then, in June 1999, in the same area, authorities found mutilated limbs stuffed into 4 garbage bags and dumped in a wooded area. At first, investigators suspected that these remains were connected to the severed head. But since the torso was never found, all the remains were classified as belonging to a male. At the time the body fragments were discovered, Melissa Wolfenbarger had not yet been reported missing. As a result, the gruesome finds remained unidentified. Because the person's death was clearly a homicide, the remains were never buried. They were kept in storage. In reality, these remains had been found just months after Melissa's disappearance, near the glass company where her husband, Christopher Wolfenbarger, had once worked. Norma Patton had heard about the discovery in the news. However, reports at the time stated that the victim was most likely a Caucasian male. She had thanked God that it wasn't her daughter. Now, after so many years, she learned the truth. The remains belonged to Melissa. When convicted killer Carl Patton was informed that his daughter was most likely dead, he broke down and cried. What angered him the most was the fact that her dismembered body had been found long ago. It took the arrest of the perpetrator's father for the remains to finally be identified. The worst part was that a DNA test had not been conducted immediately when Melissa's mother first reported her missing in early 2000. Melissa's body remained unidentified until 2003, when the remains were finally compared to Carl Patton's DNA. This also meant that crucial evidence had likely been lost over time. An autopsy revealed that Melissa's neck had been cut with a mechanical saw. Her skull was almost completely hairless as it had been doused in bleach. This was why the remains had initially been misidentified as male. It is unknown whether these actions were carried out post-mortem or if they were part of torture inflicted on her while she was still alive. Her head and limbs, including her hands, legs, and feet, had been placed in garbage bags and discarded. The location where they were dumped was no accident. The area was known for heavy traffic, making it impossible to track the vehicle used to transport the remains. Determining the exact cause of death was also impossible due to the absence of Melissa's torso, which was never found. When Christopher Wolfenbarger was informed about the location of his missing wife's remains, he didn't rush to claim them. Melissa's mother, Norma Patton, believed that Chris was responsible for her daughter's death. She had never liked him and never wanted her daughter to marry him. Moreover, Melissa's body parts had been discarded near Chris's workplace. For the police, Wolfenbarger was still a person of interest. No charges were filed against him, but he was called in for another round of questioning. In an interview, Christopher stated that he had always cooperated with the investigation and had even provided his DNA years ago. According to him, he had nothing to hide. He had absolutely no reason to kill Melissa. They didn't have life insurance policies or any valuable assets. Besides, he claimed he would never have been so reckless as to dump her remains near his workplace, bringing suspicion upon himself. Christopher also admitted to reporters that he had truly believed his wife had changed her name and left to seek a better life. Deep down, he had hoped that she would return one day, at least for the sake of their children. That was why he never reported her missing to the police. Melissa's older sister, Tina, took her loss the hardest. For a long time, she couldn't come to terms with the lack of closure in the case. Tina even had dreams where Melissa appeared to her, calling for help. Carl Patton, sitting in prison and unable to say goodbye to his daughter, went through a profound change. Failing to get justice for Melissa, he finally understood what it felt like to lose a loved one. Her death made him realize what other families had gone through, and that no one deserved such pain. The most shocking part of this case was that a serial killer spent most of his time behind bars fighting for justice for his youngest daughter. But before that, he made one final confession, his 5th crime. Carl told investigators that on March 8, 1973, 4 years before the crimes for which he had already been convicted, he took the life of a man named Richard Russell Jackson. Maria White, the wife of his uncle, who later hired Carl to kill her unfaithful husband, had first asked him for a criminal favor years earlier. According to Maria, Richard Jackson had been her first husband. She claimed he had abused, insulted, and humiliated her throughout their marriage. Now married to Fred White, Carl's uncle, she wanted revenge. So, in the end, Carl had eliminated both of this woman's husbands. Unfortunately, verifying Carl's story was impossible, as Maria White had died in 1988, 10 years before Melissa's disappearance and 35 years before his confession. Carl was once again extradited to another county to stand trial. He testified that he and his friend, Joe Cleveland, had lured Richard into a car, driven him to a wooded area, and then shot him. Everyone in the courtroom was shocked when the victim's daughter, Gladys Elaine Jackson, stood up to speak. The young woman made a statement, thanking Carl Patton. Mrs. Jackson told the court that her father had constantly abused her mother, Maria, and that Fred White, Maria's next husband and Gladys's stepfather, had also been violent toward her. According to Gladys, both of these men were monsters. Her childhood memories were filled with images of blood, bruises, and her mother's broken bones. So, by sending both men to their graves, Mr. Patton had done Maria and her children a favor. Otherwise, one of them would have eventually beaten Maria to death. However, Richard Jackson's family insisted that Maria had been a manipulator who only wanted to collect life insurance money. That was why she had ordered Carl Patton to eliminate both of her husbands. In the end, Melissa's father was sentenced to yet another life term. Carl told the police that no one else had ever died by his hand. Authorities, however, were highly skeptical of such a statement. This was a man who had killed 5 people, then suddenly lived as a law-abiding citizen for 20 years. One thing investigators were certain of, though: Carl had loved his daughter, and he would never have harmed her. So, Melissa's remains had been found, but no one was ever arrested or charged in connection with her death. In 2017, Norma Patton reached out to cold case investigator Cheryl McCollum, asking for help in finding answers about Melissa's case. Cheryl McCollum, the founder and director of the Cold Case Investigative Research Institute, frequently hosts a popular program that delves into unsolved cases. She is also the host of the true crime podcast Zone 7. Cheryl vividly remembers the moment she first saw Norma Patton. It was at a formal dinner for an event she was hosting. As Cheryl spoke on stage, she noticed a woman enter the room, dressed more for a day at the beach than for a formal gathering. When the event ended, the stranger approached her and said, "My daughter was decapitated, and I need your help." That woman was Norma Patton. Without hesitation, Cheryl agreed to hear her story. And Norma certainly had a story to tell. Armed with folders full of information, she was ready to talk. A mother exhausted from years of seeking justice for her daughter, she immediately warned the Zone 7 host about the fact that her husband was in prison for murdering 5 people. She herself had been given probation for helping him dispose of the bodies. But now, this wasn't about them, it was about their missing daughter. Cheryl told Norma that she would need to speak with Carl Patton to build a full victimology. Meanwhile, she reached out to search specialists to bring in cadaver dogs and re-examine the wooded area where the black garbage bags containing Melissa's remains had once been found. Cheryl hoped to find the torso, or at least some new leads that could get to the truth. Unfortunately, the search yielded no results. But Norma convinced Cheryl not to stop, urging her to speak with anyone willing to talk, because you never know who might be the person to finally provide the missing piece of the puzzle. So Cheryl continued investigating the case of Melissa Wolfenbarger. The investigator corresponded with the father of the missing young woman for a long time. In these letters, Carl Patton shared his opinion on who was responsible for his daughter's death. There was only one person he firmly named as the suspected killer: Melissa's husband and his own son-in-law, Christopher Wolfenbarger. Carl had no other suspects in mind. He mentioned that he wouldn't take Christopher's life, only for the sake of his grandchildren. But if he were ever released from prison, he wouldn't miss the chance to meet them and play a role in their lives. Carl recalled the first time he held Melissa in his arms, feeling as if his own heart was beating inside her. She was a happy, beautiful young girl who did well in school and had a bright future ahead of her. But everything changed when she met Christopher Wolfenbarger. According to Carl, this man had a bad influence on her. His daughter started sneaking out of her bedroom window at night just to see him. Chris taught her how to steal. Twice, the young couple had tried to steal Carl's car to run away to California. When Melissa became pregnant and gave birth to their daughter, Christopher did everything he could to keep both her and their newborn Christina away from her grandparents. The only time they were able to see each other was when Chris was at work. Melissa told her parents that she would be in serious trouble if her husband found out about their visit. Despite the constant bruises on her arms and neck, marks left by Chris, she was in love with him and refused to listen to anyone. Her parents tried to make her understand that their relationship was unsafe, toxic, and would only end badly. But Melissa believed everything would be fine. When she failed to show up for Christmas and her parents couldn't find her, Carl felt it in his soul. He knew that Chris had done something to Melissa, but he had no way to prove it. What hurt him the most was that his grandchildren didn't even know the truth, that their mother hadn't abandoned them to chase a better life. She was dead. Even in prison, Carl tried to assist in the investigation. His genuine love for his daughter and his sincere desire to bring her killer to justice removed the last suspicions against him. Still, after 5 murder confessions, police couldn't help but wonder if Carl had played a role in Melissa's disappearance. Carl insisted that investigators re-examine the trash bags in which her remains had been found for any traces of DNA. He believed that whoever tied those knots might have left behind an unnoticed clue, because no crime was truly perfect. But despite their efforts, detectives never found any evidence linking Christopher to his wife's disappearance. At the end of his letter, Carl thanked the host for taking on his daughter's case. He also mentioned that losing Melissa and feeling that pain had finally made him truly understand the damage he had inflicted on others, on the families who had lost their loved ones because of his crimes. Following this, Zone 7 host Cheryl McCollum interviewed the children of Liddy Evans, as there was speculation that Melissa might have been harmed by the relatives of Carl's victims. Some believed that someone could have sought revenge on Carl by targeting his daughter. However, the problem with this theory was that Carl's crimes were only uncovered several years after Melissa's disappearance. The children of Liddy Evans agreed to participate in the podcast, to share their mother's story, and to help bring justice for Melissa. In their view, a mother of 2 children also deserved justice, even if she was the daughter of the man who had murdered their own mother. During the interview, Cheryl read them one of Carl's letters, in which he wrote that he prayed for their forgiveness. Forensic expert Joseph Morgan then analyzed the autopsy findings and provided insight into the killer's profile. In his opinion, the crime was deeply personal. He also suggested that the dismemberment had not taken place in the Wolfenbarger's duplex. Instead, he theorized that it may have occurred at the glass company where Christopher had once worked, as Melissa's remains had been found in a dump site behind the building, which also had the necessary tools for such an act. However, no blood or DNA traces were ever found at the facility. As a result, investigators were never able to pinpoint the actual crime scene or determine where Melissa's body had been dismembered. Cheryl spoke with Norma and Melissa's sister, Tina. She exchanged letters with Carl, consulted experts, and brought in forensic specialists. After reviewing the case materials, these professionals conducted their own independent investigation. But it was a long and painstaking process. Yet, despite all the time and effort, everyone involved in the case came to the same conclusion. They all suspected one person, Christopher Wolfenbarger. Cheryl declared that she would stake her reputation on ensuring that the person responsible for the death of the young mother of 2 would be convicted. Melissa's case was one of the first stories covered on her Zone 7 podcast, which launched in February 2023. Then, in April 2024, a listener reached out to Cheryl with crucial information. This person claimed to have witnessed the Wolfenbarger's behavior at a party. Cheryl immediately forwarded this information to the lead detectives. After more than 2 decades of unanswered questions, the case suddenly gained momentum, developing at lightning speed over the next few months. In early August, Melissa's husband was arrested on suspicion of murder. Detective Calhoun, the lead investigator on Melissa's case, wanted to personally inform her father about the arrest. Back in 2003, it was Calhoun himself who had told Carl that his daughter's remains had been identified, thanks only to Carl's persistence. The officer who had spent years investigating the case didn't want Carl to hear about the arrest from the news. But unfortunately, Carl wasn't allowed phone calls until Thursday. So the detective drove to the prison to tell Carl in person, one father to another. Years ago, Carl Patton had been devastated when he learned that his daughter was dead. But now, when he heard that Chris had been arrested, he was overjoyed. The man literally jumped for joy, thrilled that his suspicions about his son-in-law had been right all along. On August 7, 2024, the Atlanta Police Department held a press conference to address public interest in the case and to officially announce the arrest of Christopher Wolfenbarger, the man who had been a person of interest from the very beginning. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses, explored additional leads, and utilized new forensic technology. By piecing together all the facts, they finalized their probable cause argument and were finally able to take the suspect into custody. Police described the circumstances of Christopher's arrest. He had been found at his home in Griffin, hiding behind a clothes dryer. It was highly unlikely that an innocent man would try to hide from law enforcement. As he was taken into custody, Christopher continued to insist on his innocence. Officials did not disclose the specific evidence they had against him or what his possible motive might have been. With a trial still ahead, the case remained under sealed investigation. Melissa's mother, Norma, and her older sister, Tina, attended the press conference. Norma stated that she no longer needed to watch the news because the man who had taken her daughter was now behind bars. The elderly woman prayed that Christopher would remain there forever. Now they faced one final obstacle: securing Christopher's conviction. For 25 years, this family waited for justice for Melissa. They never stopped believing that the investigation would one day come to a close, and their faith was finally rewarded. From the very first day she met Christopher, Norma Patton saw pure evil in his eyes. She even once compared her son-in-law's stare to a photograph of Charles Manson. Unfortunately, Melissa's parents couldn't protect their daughter from this man. But her story now serves as a powerful illustration of the possible consequences for families affected by domestic violence. Many in the public had little sympathy for the Patton family, believing that their suffering was simply divine punishment for their past sins. Carl Patton, the convicted killer of 5 people, had already come to terms with his guilt and had repented. But time could never be reversed. And for him to truly understand the pain he had inflicted on others, he had to experience the loss of his beloved daughter. All these years, Melissa's children remained in the custody of Christopher's mother. Melissa's side of the family, Norma, Carl, and Tina, was not allowed to see them. They had always hoped that once the children were grown, they would finally learn the truth, that their mother had loved them deeply and had stayed with Chris only for their sake. Now an adult, Christina, Melissa and Christopher's daughter, shared her experience of growing up with her father. As a teenager, she became deeply frustrated with him. Whenever she asked about her mother, Christopher either told her a completely different story or got angry. So she began researching on her own, using social media to find answers. One day, she came across the case of her missing mother, Melissa Wolfenbarger. At 18, Christina reached out to her aunt Tina and her grandmother Norma. They met in person. Christina felt an immediate connection, and they have been inseparable ever since. Reuniting with her mother's family filled the void she had felt in her heart since childhood. She said that nothing would ever bring her mother back. But at least now, she had the chance to learn who Melissa truly was. Her only memory of her was from when she was very little, sitting in the back seat of a car, listening as her happy mother, Melissa, sang while driving. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The mother of many children sat motionless on the couch while her kids were unwrapping Christmas presents. She didn't respond to questions, didn't enjoy the holiday, and seemed strange, distant, or even dead. This completely wild story happened to a young woman from California on Christmas Eve. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. On Christmas morning of 2011 in Anaheim, California, William Wallace and his wife, Zazelle Preston, were watching their children unwrap presents. 7 weeks earlier, the couple had welcomed a baby boy, and the scene in their living room that morning seemed like something out of a heartwarming fairy tale. A tree glittering with lights, joyful children, a pile of brightly wrapped gifts, and happy parents. It was William and Zazelle's first Christmas as a married couple. However, in reality, the atmosphere in their apartment was far from festive. It resembled the opening scene of a horror movie. In the early December morning of 2011, a paramedic crew in Anaheim was heading to a local apartment complex. The dispatcher reported that the victim was a young woman who had overindulged in alcohol the night before and fell so badly that she hit her head. Her partner had called emergency services, believing that his wife had a concussion. When the ambulance arrived at the home, they saw a man outside waving his arms. The young man gestured to indicate that he was the one who called the paramedics. As soon as the EMTs entered the home, they immediately realized that something very strange had happened there. Blood was everywhere, on every surface, on the light switches, on the walls, on the countertops, on the floor, even on the children's toys. It seemed like there wasn't a single item in the house untouched by red splatters. The paramedics who had responded to the 911 call immediately understood that the intoxicated woman hadn't simply fallen and suffered a concussion. There was far too much blood in the apartment for it to be explained by an accidental fall. The EMTs quickly determined that the woman's injuries went far beyond a concussion. She was dead, and it hadn't happened within the past half hour either. The woman's name was Zazelle Dominique Preston. Her friends called her Zezzy. She was 26 years old at the time of her death. Zezzy was born on September 5, 1985 in Anaheim, California. She was one of 5 children, but she didn't know or had never seen her father. Her childhood world was limited to her brothers, sisters, mother, and grandmother. Zezzy spent her childhood living between 2 homes, which helped her form a strong spiritual bond with her grandmother, with whom her warmest memories were connected. Zazelle grew up as a creative child. She was drawn to everything related to art. She loved to sing, dance, and then express her emotions on paper. Her head was always filled with fantastic ideas. During her teenage years, Zezzy continued to dedicate a lot of time to creativity. But gradually, her passions began to take a back seat when boys, first love, and the bright new feeling of discovering herself as a person came into the picture. Zazelle was a completely normal girl with typical teenage problems and interests. When Zazelle turned 17, all her creative aspirations came to a complete stop because she unexpectedly became pregnant by a classmate. In 2003, she gave birth to a daughter, while still being, essentially, a child herself. But Zazelle took this step seriously. She was ready to do anything to provide for herself and her little girl. Zezzy worked at a fast food chain and a clothing store at the same time. She did makeup gigs and even tried her hand at modeling. It was hard to take care of a child, look after herself, and still find time to make money. However, Zazelle didn't give up or let her hands drop. The young woman was genuinely happy to have become a mother at such a young age. Her family and loved ones supported her, and life went on. 5 years later, when Zazelle was 22, she became pregnant again. And once again, it was a girl. It is unknown whether the same man fathered both of Zizi's daughters. But in reality, there was never a man by her side who helped her care for the children. However, other close relatives were present in the girls' lives: aunts and uncles, their grandmother and great-grandmother. The family helped Zazelle and supported her emotionally, as well as participated in raising the little girls. In 2008, Zazelle, now a mother of 2 daughters, a 5-year-old and a newborn, met a man who would change her life forever. William Wallace was a 26-year-old medical professional from San Pedro, California. He was 4 years older than Zezi. William's life, especially his childhood, had been extremely difficult. Essentially, he had been raised by the streets, as his parents had absolutely no interest in him. From a young age, he was used to handling problems on his own. Sometimes his methods were wild, and he simply didn't know the right way to act. William was used to being in full control of his life. After meeting Zazelle, he shifted that control onto her. Just a few months after they met, William moved into Zazelle's apartment. It was as if Zezi was wearing rose-colored glasses. She put her trust in someone she barely knew. All the red flags she dismissed as quirks of character and didn't pay them proper attention. To her, it felt like a honeymoon with the man of her dreams. But one day, the honeymoon phase suddenly ended when William raised his hand against his beloved. And it wasn't just that. He beat her beyond recognition. Zazelle was taken to the hospital with a swollen face, clumps of hair ripped out, and numerous bruises. This horrific assault didn't happen without reason, and it's known what typically triggers such outbursts of rage in men like William. Usually, their anger doesn't stem from any real or tangible cause. Most often, it's due to pathological jealousy or irrational thoughts inside their own heads. In William's case, his rage was fueled by large amounts of alcohol he consumed. The next incident occurred in July 2008. Zazelle was taking a bath when a drunk William barged in. He was furious and clearly looking for a reason to start a fight. Zazelle had already dealt with the consequences of similar outbursts before, so she got out of the bath, wrapped herself in a towel, and tried to go to the bedroom, not wanting to engage in an unnecessary argument. Enraged by what he saw as her disregard, the man became even more furious. He stopped Zezi and slammed her head into the wall with full force. When the woman fell to the floor, William grabbed her by the hair, dragged her into the bedroom, and threw her onto the bed. With one hand, he held Zazelle by the neck, and with the other, he continued to beat her until she lost consciousness. Even after the victim went limp and stopped responding, William kept shouting at her and hitting her. After finally stepping away from the unconscious body, the man continued to pace around the room, voicing all his grievances. He yelled so loudly that Zezi began to regain consciousness from the sound of his shouting. This did not go unnoticed. William attacked the defenseless woman again. She desperately tried to protect herself, scratching and begging him to spare her life, but her pleas went unheard. At some point, Zezi managed to twist away and escape the room. She ran out of the apartment and approached the first person she saw for help. Zazelle asked them to call the police so the authorities could protect her from her own boyfriend. By the time the police responded to the call, William Wallace had fled, knowing he was in serious trouble. The officers were unable to do anything. Zazelle had to spend a sleepless night in fear, waiting for her partner to return. When William came back, she called the police again, and this time he was arrested. In the end, he pleaded guilty to a domestic violence-related offense and was sentenced to 19 days in jail. This case was a vivid example of how domestic abusers are somehow never taken seriously until they finally snap and take someone's life. However, the story didn't end there. Over the next 3 years, Zazelle tried more than once to rid her home of this man's presence. After the arrest, she managed to obtain something like a temporary restraining order against William, which meant that, by law, they were not allowed to have contact. This was done for Zazelle's safety. After getting out of jail, William wanted to return to Zazel's apartment. At first, she didn't want to take him back. But it's very easy to convince a woman in love that something like that will never happen again. William persisted and kept coming back, waiting for Zezi on the street and trying to convince her that he had changed, that he was a completely different person now. Soon, he found the perfect excuse to persuade Zazel to take him back. He told his ex that he had found God. Supposedly, this happened after another arrest, when he was sent to jail on a drug possession charge. After serving the 19-day sentence for assaulting his girlfriend, William was released. He spent about 3 months free, and then he was arrested again. This time, he served almost 2 years, from November 2008 to October 2010. While behind bars, William claimed he had recognized all his sins and found God. He told Zazel that he was now a man of faith, living by and following God's laws, that he was a born-again Christian. William filled Zazel's head with thoughts that he had changed and that only she could make him better. He poured his soul and all his love out to her. No matter how hurt Zazel was by her ex-boyfriend, she still loved him and was willing to forgive. A little over 2 years had passed since that horrific assault. The woman believed that this was enough time for a person to reflect on their actions and decided to give William a chance. While William was still serving his sentence, he managed to convince Zezi of the purity of his feelings. She began visiting him regularly in jail. When he was released in October 2010, he immediately moved into the apartment where Zazel and her 2 daughters lived. The couple rekindled their relationship. However, it didn't take more than a couple of months for the halo of the reborn Christian to slip off, and for the devil to once again show his true face. During the first few months, Zazel's social media posts were filled with love, tenderness, and happiness. She cherished each beautiful day, but gradually, the positive tone began to fade. Her posts turned into much more emotional expressions where she tried to release what had been building up in her soul. She felt that her own man didn't respect her. He began raising his hand to her more and more often. On top of that, he started eyeing other women. When Zazel found proof of his infidelity, William acted like a classic manipulator. He told her she was crazy, that she was imagining cheating where there was none. In cases he couldn't deny, William blamed the other women, saying they were the ones throwing themselves at him. No matter what happened, he was always the victim. In his reasoning, the whole world was against their relationship, so they had to stick together and trust no one but each other. The scariest thing about manipulators is that they use the right words, play on people's emotions, and the victim actually starts to believe them. Zizi would often express her frustration on social media, aimed at other women. She advised them to find their own man instead of clinging to someone who was already in a relationship. Friends in the comments tried to open her eyes to what was happening, but Zazel listened to no one but her William. Over the next year, William went in and out of jail. He was arrested for drug possession, domestic violence, and fighting. Every time he was released, he returned to Zazel's home. Time and time again, he attacked Zezi in front of her daughters, abused her, and took out his aggression on her. The restraining order against him was still in effect, so with every incident of violence, the police would show up and arrest him. Since this went on for months, Zazel tried to leave William, but he was a master of apologies, and he easily earned her forgiveness. And if that didn't work, William simply resorted to threats. The woman feared for her life and the lives of her daughters and forgave his outbursts. For a while, he would become affectionate and caring. Zezi would let her guard down and step on the same rake all over again. However, soon there was an unexpected twist in the story, one that bound the 2 lovers even more tightly. In 2011, Zazel Preston became pregnant by William. This news sparked hope that now things would finally change. Zezi was carrying William's child and believed he would stop beating her and start caring about her well-being. But Zazel was wrong. The man began behaving even worse than before. One time during her pregnancy, she had to hide in a grocery store because her boyfriend started beating her right on the street. On another occasion, Zezi was hospitalized due to a ruptured eardrum. Although she didn't admit it, all her loved ones knew she had lost hearing because of a severe blow to the head. In August 2011, when Zazelle was in the final months of pregnancy, she had to turn to her mother for help after William had beaten her badly. When her mother arrived, she found her daughter lying in the street. Zezi was curled up in a fetal position and quietly crying. Her entire body, including her belly, was covered in bruises. Of course, Zazelle fully understood that her life with this man resembled hell. As a child, she dreamed of growing up and building a career so she could be independent. She had to give up on that because every day was now about simply surviving. But if nothing changed, the situation would remain the same, or it would end in tragedy. Better late than never, Zazelle decided. The first step toward escaping this horrific relationship would be a stable career and her own income. In September 2011, Zazelle enrolled in college and began attending classes to become a domestic violence counselor. This course would not only give the young woman a chance to build a positive and long-term career, but it might also help her learn how to stop the violence in her own home. At that time, Zazelle's daughters were 8 and 3 years old. William agreed to look after them while Zezi went to school, but he quickly got tired of staying home while his girlfriend was off somewhere at college, talking to who knows whom. William constantly called her cell phone and sent a flood of messages. He demanded that Zazelle not speak to strangers, not talk to other students, especially young men. At home, he tried to isolate her from friends and family, forbade her from going outside, and stopped her from chatting on the phone. Zazelle just wanted it all to end. She desperately tried to find a way to calm her man down. On November 7th, 2011, despite her family's strong objections, Zezi and William officially became husband and wife. Zazelle hoped that this new status would improve their relationship, that William would become more stable and let go of his jealousy and paranoia. She believed that by fully dedicating herself to the man before God and the law, she would protect herself from his aggression. Unfortunately to William, the official marriage meant nothing. Now he completely considered Zazelle his property, and on their wedding night, he beat his wife so severely that she went into premature labor the very next day. Even though Zazelle's life with William more closely resembled pure hell, she still held onto a glimmer of hope for a happy and safe future. Zezi had grown up in a big family, and now she was slowly but surely trying to build one of her own. For 2 weeks after their son was born, her husband didn't touch her. But on November 24th, William lost control again. It happened at a family Thanksgiving dinner. Zazelle had asked her sister's husband to help her figure out some settings on her phone. William didn't like that. He thought his wife was paying too much attention to her brother-in-law. He was so angry, he looked like he was ready to tear Zezi to pieces. By December 2011, Preston was completely broken. She no longer believed that her knowledge of domestic violence could help her change her husband. By then, she fully realized that William couldn't be fixed, and their marriage couldn't be saved. She decided that she would finish her exams and then leave with her children, go somewhere far away. On December 9th, just a month after giving birth to their son, Zazelle ended up in the hospital again. This time, it was due to a cut on the back of her head. Of course, it was yet another injury caused by William. Even the hospital staff began to recognize Zazelle, who showed up month after month with some new, horrific injury. Whether it was a swollen head, bruises, or a concussion. It was no secret to anyone that this woman was constantly in danger at home. The doctors tried to involve the police, but Zazelle herself was afraid of the authorities getting involved because she had learned that if William ended up behind bars again, he'd come out even angrier. And he would take that anger out on her. Instead of telling the truth about her husband, Zazelle lied to the officers and said she had been attacked by a stranger on the street. She was simply afraid for her life and the lives of her children. To the doctor's frustration, law enforcement couldn't do anything without the cooperation of the victim. A few days later, Zazelle was discharged from the hospital and William sent her to the store to buy groceries. But at the register, she realized she didn't have enough money to buy what her husband had asked for. Zazelle was too afraid to go home, knowing there would be consequences. In the end, she stood outside a local restaurant and began asking strangers for spare change. She felt it was better to endure the shame than to come home empty-handed and be beaten bloody by her husband. However, even that didn't save Zazelle from another beating. Her husband still thought she had taken too long shopping, and William lost control again. During this violent outburst, Zazelle called her mother and begged her to save her. Her mother, on the other end of the line, could hear William punching her daughter in the stomach and repeatedly demanding that she hang up the phone. The woman was too far away to get there quickly, so she called Zezzy's grandmother Sally and begged her to rescue her granddaughter from the hands of a monster. When Sally arrived at the house, her heart nearly stopped at what she saw. Zazelle and her 3 children, one of them still an infant, were standing outside in the pouring rain. A small neighborhood boy stood in front of William, trying to protect the woman. Sally loaded her granddaughter and the children into her car and took them to a local shopping mall, where there were a lot of people around. Grandma knew she wouldn't be able to handle the man if he showed up at her home. In reality, they didn't even get a moment to breathe after the stress they had just endured, because William jumped into his car and followed them directly to the mall. He demanded that Zazelle and the children get into his car and come home. And once they were back in the apartment, William once again used manipulation tactics and managed to convince his wife to forgive him. At that moment, Zazelle felt like she had no other choice. On December 17th, a week after the incident, Zezzy and her grandmother Sally went out shopping. They were picking out Christmas gifts for the children. Zazelle wanted to make this Christmas unforgettable. While they were walking around the mall, Zazelle's phone didn't stop ringing for even a minute. It was her husband, going crazy because she was taking too long. Sally noticed that her granddaughter couldn't take her eyes off the phone and asked how she could even live with a man like that. Zazelle burst into tears and said she was afraid for her life. Then she shared her plans for the future with her grandmother. First, she needed to finish college, get a job using the qualification she'd earned from her course, and only then move forward with her life separately from William. Zezzy didn't yet know that her plans would never come true. Just a week later, on Christmas Day 2011, her worst fears became reality. On the eve of the holiday, Zazelle and William went to a neighbor's house for a small Christmas party. They were drinking, talking, and enjoying holiday food, and it seemed like everything was fine between them. The couple was having a great time with friends, but after several hours of celebrating, they began arguing about having left the children home alone. The argument escalated into a fight. Zazelle and William suddenly decided to leave and headed home around midnight, both in a bad mood. As soon as the door to their apartment closed behind them, the verbal argument, as always, turned into physical violence. The fight became so loud it woke their eldest daughter. Zazelle's 8-year-old daughter came out of her bedroom and tried to calm the adults down. Of course, it didn't work. On top of that, the child witnessed a horrifying scene of William violently beating her mother. The man shoved his wife, slapped her, and kicked her. Zazelle begged him to stop and screamed so loudly that the neighbors could hear the noise. The assault lasted nearly an hour. The woman was covered in blood, but she managed to run outside. Neighbors saw through the window as William ran up behind Zazelle, pushed her to the ground, then picked her up and carried her back into the apartment. But they did nothing. They returned to bed and tried to forget what they had seen. Some people were simply afraid to call 911 about what they had witnessed, not wanting to waste police time in case they had misunderstood what was happening. But if they had made that call to emergency services, perhaps things would have ended very differently. That night, no one called the police, and no one came to save Zazelle. The woman was trapped in the apartment with William, who cornered her in the living room and, in a drunken rage, continued beating her, then shoved her onto a glass table. The glass shattered, and sharp shards pierced poor Zezzy's skin. Worst of all, the man involved her 8-year-old daughter in the violence. He ordered her to go to her mother, pull the glass shards out of her wounds, and then clean up the blood. William didn't care what kind of psychological trauma the little girl would suffer. Watching the child, he realized that wiping the blood wouldn't be enough, so he filled the bathtub, picked his wife up in his arms, and lowered her limp body into the water. While Zezi soaked in the tub, her daughter stood nearby in confusion, not knowing how to help her mom. Zazelle drifted in and out of consciousness. She had lost so much blood that her strength was completely gone. Once most of the blood had been washed from her body, William pulled her out of the bath and tried to carry her to the bedroom, but he slipped on the wet floor and fell. Zazelle's head hit the edge of the toilet, and a gurgling sound came from her throat. Then silence. William eventually dragged his wife's body to the bedroom and threw her onto the bed. He sent the 8-year-old daughter back to sleep as well. But about half an hour later, Zezi's baby son woke up crying, calling for his mother. The boy was clearly hungry. William, not knowing what else to do, placed the baby at his mother's breast, even though she was no longer alive. Christmas Day 2011 was supposed to be a special one. Zazelle had spent a long time preparing to make the holiday unforgettable for her children. Her kids were at that perfect age, 3 and 8, when Christmas magic still feels real. Zazelle's daughters woke up at 8:30 in the morning. Excited and happy, they jumped on their beds, eagerly waiting to be allowed to open their presents and see what Santa had left under the Christmas tree. The 8-year-old, because of her age, had already forgotten the nightmare of the night before and was just happy for the new day. Seeing adults fight wasn't unusual for them. They had lived in that environment long enough to get used to it. They knew that by morning, things would usually be okay again. Their mom, even with a swollen face and bruises all over her body, would still be the same sweet and caring woman. But that Christmas morning was different. She had been dead for hours. What William did next defied all sense of reality. He knew the children would immediately go looking for their mother. So he carried Zezi's dead body into the living room, sat her on the couch, and propped her up with pillows on both sides so she wouldn't fall over. He placed sunglasses over her swollen shut eyes and then called the little girls in to open their Christmas presents. Of course, the girls quickly noticed something was wrong with their mom. She didn't respond to their greetings, didn't speak to them, and didn't smile even once. But William kept up the sick act. He told the children their mother had gotten drunk and ruined Christmas for them. When the girls touched her, they could feel that her hands were strange, cold and stiff. They tried to talk to her, but she didn't answer. Zazelle couldn't respond, because on December 25th, 2011, on what should have been a magical Christmas morning, the cold cruelty of her husband took her life. She was only 26 years old. She was the mother of 3 beautiful children, and now her cold, lifeless body sat on the couch while her daughters opened the Christmas presents she had spent hours picking out the week before. It became her final act as a mother. Despite the abuse she suffered from her husband, she had made sure her children would wake up to joy and a pile of gifts on Christmas morning. By this point, William Wallace had sobered up and was in full-blown panic. After drinking too much the night before and getting into a violent fight, he had assumed that, as always, Zazelle would come to her senses by morning. That's how it had happened every time he'd beaten her unconscious. Somehow, the next day, the woman would always recover. But now, watching the children desperately trying to wake their mom, William realized that Zezi wasn't responding because she was dead. When it finally hit him that he had taken his wife's life, William truly panicked. On top of that, Zazelle's mother called and asked to speak to her daughter. William told her that Zazelle hadn't woken up yet. He explained that they had gotten into an argument the night before. According to him, she had been drunk, fell, and hit her head, and now couldn't come to. Naturally, her mother became worried and asked her son-in-law to call an ambulance. The terrified William replied that he had enough to deal with already. He said he didn't have time to wait for emergency services, fill out police reports, and all that. And he certainly wasn't planning to go to jail. His excuses sounded suspicious. News of this strange conversation spread quickly among Zazelle's relatives. Realizing their family member could be in serious danger, they began calling William, asking about her condition. When Zaze's cousin told William he was coming over to check for himself, William broke. His wife's family could show up at any minute, so he decided to act first. At 9:30 a.m., William dialed 911. During the call with the dispatcher, he sounded relatively calm. He suggested that his wife might have a concussion from how hard she hit her head the night before. But when paramedics arrived at the apartment, they immediately realized something serious had happened. There was blood everywhere. Not a single surface in the home was untouched by splatter. Some of the drops were fresh, others long dried. But the strangest thing was that the victim's clothes were perfectly clean. Just one glance at Zazelle told the medical team she no longer needed help. The woman had been dead for several hours, and she hadn't died of natural causes. Her life had been intentionally taken. The paramedics called the police. William Wallace was immediately arrested on suspicion of murder, and Zazelle's body was taken to the coroner's office. The autopsy revealed a horrifying picture. There wasn't a single uninjured part of her body. According to the forensic pathologist, the cause of death was a brain hemorrhage caused by blunt force trauma. The evidence of the crime was absolutely undeniable. It was all over the house, and every inch of the victim's body pointed to a violent, intentional death. But even though the case seemed clear, it took nearly a decade to convict William and deliver justice for Zazelle. William remained in jail, with bail set at $1 million. He spent the next 9 years awaiting trial. And there were several reasons for the delay. First of all, William was African American. A 2002 report found that across the United States, young black men were about 50% more likely to be held in pre-trial detention than white men. And this disparity affected not only the accused, but also black victims, like Zazelle. Zazelle's family had to sit and wait for years, while the man who took the life of their loved one remained unpunished. Secondly, the main witness in the case was an 8-year-old child, Zazelle's oldest daughter. Not only had she witnessed the attack, but she had also tried to help her mother by pulling shards of glass from her wounds. Zazelle, in fact, died in front of the little girl when her head struck the edge of the toilet after a fall caused by William. It seemed the court wanted the girl to grow older before they could rely on her testimony. Due to her age and the trauma she had experienced, the child changed some details in her story a few times. She was deeply afraid of William. Having lived in such an unstable and abusive environment for so long, she, like her mother, had learned to suppress her emotions and speak as little as possible. William had constantly threatened Zazelle, saying he would kill her if she ever went to the police. Now the child, when speaking with law enforcement, feared the same fate. After a long and painful 9-year wait, Zazelle's case finally went to trial in March 2021. Even after all those years, William Wallace continued to stick to his version of events. He still claimed that his wife had gotten drunk, fallen, and hit her head, suffering a concussion. He denied all the evidence, insisting that Zazelle had thrown herself onto the glass table and shattered it. He claimed he didn't push her. He said she had caused all of those severe injuries to herself. The defendant always had an excuse, even if it sounded unbelievable. William's family and friends even tried to shift blame onto the victim, claiming that she had also hit him. They said they'd seen bruises under William's eye and scratches on his face. But it would have been surprising if Zazelle hadn't tried to defend herself against a man who regularly beat her. William was stunned when Zazelle's oldest daughter appeared in court, now 17 years old. She was ready to share her truth and served as the prosecution's key witness. The girl had to return to her childhood and relive the horrors of that night. Memories she had tried so hard to forget. She told the judge and jury in vivid detail what had actually happened behind the closed doors of their home on Christmas night. Her testimony against William matched all the forensic evidence, the injuries on Zazelle's body, and the crime scene inside the apartment. On April 7, 2021, William was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and domestic violence. The crimes were classified as a kind of tragic accident, the result of William slipping on a wet bathroom floor and dropping his wife. Although every blow William delivered could have been fatal, the fact that Zazel died from hitting her head on the toilet edge played the most decisive role in the verdict. William Wallace was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with credit for the 9 years he had already served. This meant he could be released as early as 2027. After Zazel's death, her grandmother Sally said that, in truth, William had been draining the life out of her long before she actually died. In her final years, Zazel wasn't truly living. She was just surviving, afraid to escape the monster she was trapped with. She had even gone back to school to save herself and other women in similar situations. But she never got the chance to fulfill that mission. Instead, a college professor who taught her took it upon himself. He shared Zazel Preston's story with his students as a warning. All 3 of Zezi's children were placed in the care of her mother. They would go on to live safe and happy lives, in a home where they were loved and where they found peace after a traumatic childhood spent near a monster. Zazel Preston's story stirs complex emotions, but it's unlikely to leave anyone indifferent. Let it serve as a warning to other women going through similar abuse, who still hope their violent partner will one day become the perfect husband and father. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.